The warehouse sat at the edge of an old industrial zone, its rusted tin roof etched with long scars of time. The first winds of the season slipped through warped door frames, carrying the scent of rotting wood and damp sweat. Inside, pale yellow lights cast dim halos across the concrete floor, illuminating rows of steel cages arranged like sterile display cases. Every time someone called out a number, a wave of barking, scratching, and howling surged through the hall, voices of dogs desperate to be let out of confinement. The crowd was small but sharp-eyed, their gazes cutting quickly through the rows like appraisers sifting through forgotten goods. Some snapped photos, others scribbled notes into small pads. A few children tagged along, giggling at the glossy-coated, bright-eyed dogs that looked as if they'd stepped straight out of a training brochure. But at the far end, where the light faded into dust, one cage sat slightly askew, pushed out of line like a rejected thought. Inside it curled a shape so still it could have been a shadow. No name, no voice, no presence. The tag read, Lot 47. No name, no age, no record of training, no health documents, just a German shepherd, ribs sharp under patchy fur, ears roughened by an old tear on the left, hind leg slightly off when it moved. But it didn't move. It didn't howl. It didn't beg. It simply lay there, eyes half closed, not seeing anyone, as if it had long accepted no one would come looking. People passed. Some paused for a heartbeat. A few frowned. One smirked. Broken, someone muttered. A young trainer whispered, No reaction. No response. Waste of time. No one stopped. A cheer erupted across the hall as a cream-colored dog was sold for $300. Applause echoed off the walls. No one glanced toward the far corner, where Lot 47 remained motionless in the sliver between light and shadow. A wind chime at the door stirred as the breeze shifted, but no one noticed that in the half-light, a pair of eyes opened, not searching for a hand, not seeking a way out, but fixed on the steel door left slightly ajar, as if it was waiting for something. Something not listed in the auction program. Something unnamed. Rowan Beck arrived later than the rest. He didn't park in the main lot, but rolled his old Chevrolet into a patch of cracked gravel behind the building, where the dust from the red clay still clung to the truck bed. His boots, stained with grease, clicked softly against the floor as he stepped inside. Slow, uncertain, like a man unsure whether he should enter or simply turn around. No one had invited him. No one was expecting him with a wallet or a bleeding heart. He'd only meant to stop by, pick up a dismantling tool from the auto yard next door, and head back to the shop. But something in the noise, in the smell of the place, something layered deep in the air, made him pause, the way only memory can, when it isn't ready to die. He stepped into the warehouse with no fanfare, sleeves rolled, a desert-worn watch strap on one wrist, grease under his nails, ink still fading on the pads of his fingers. Tall, broad-shouldered, but with an expression that told strangers not to talk. Not someone here to buy a dog. He walked past each cage with a rhythm that wasn't rushed, but not exactly present either, like someone looking for something shapeless, or nothing at all. The dogs leapt as he passed, tails wagging, voices loud, eyes hopeful, but his gaze barely lingered. He didn't ask prices, didn't write anything down, didn't glance toward the front desk. And then, as he turned into the narrow path between the final two rows, he stopped. His eyes caught on something that didn't move, perhaps hadn't moved in a long time, a cage out of line, a shadow held beneath a dying bulb, a creature that had stopped asking the world for anything. Lot 47. He didn't call, didn't step forward. He just stood there, arms loose by his sides, wind lifting the edge of his sun-faded shirt, eyes resting on the emaciated frame of the German shepherd in the corner. No one introduced them, no one explained. But something passed between the two, between a man who had once stood in the center of a battlefield and a being once trained for something far more urgent than lying forgotten in a cage. Something quiet, something wordless, something that didn't need a name. It wasn't pity, nor was it quite emotion. It was simply recognition. In a space filled with auction calls and the thick scent of sweat mixed with dry kibble, there came a moment, so fleeting no one noticed. A moment that didn't last more than a few seconds, yet sliced through the noise like a breathless pause in a canvas smeared with chaos. Ash, his name not yet spoken, lifted his head. Not in haste, not with a jolt, just a quiet tilt, as though exhaustion itself had momentarily loosened its grip, letting his gaze drift toward the light. And his eyes found Rowan's, not like dog meeting man, but like two broken things meeting, in the same shape. Rowan froze. The feeling that hit him didn't come from muscle memory or trained reflexes. It wasn't clear like a question, but it carried the weight of an answer he'd buried long ago. That look in the dog's eyes didn't ask, didn't expect, didn't plead to be chosen. It simply was. The auctioneer's voice cracked across the loudspeakers, monotone and dry. Lot 47, male German Shepherd, signs of prior injury, no known history. Who'll start at 20? Silence. No whispers. No one looked up from their notes. Lot 47, 20? Rowan's gaze never left the cage. His hand curled slightly, an old habit, as if bracing to release pressure from a valve that had been sealed too long. A second later, he raised it. Not high, not loud, just enough to make the auctioneer stop mid-sentence. One bidder, the man confirmed, surprise flickering in his eyes. 20. Any raises? None. Once, twice. Sold. To the gentleman at the back. No applause, no heads turned, only the scratch of a pen on paperwork and a nod from a disinterested clerk. Rowan stepped forward toward the cage. His hand lifted but didn't touch. He unlocked the latch with a slow, reverent motion. The door clicked. Ash didn't flinch, didn't growl. He stood like a soldier hearing a command he'd obeyed many times before. Each lean step brought the faint tap of dulled claws against iron floor, but nothing seemed forced. Rowan stepped back, turned, walked. Ash followed, not pulled, not led, not looking up. He simply moved, as if this path had once been etched into both of them in some life before, where words were no longer needed, and understanding walked quietly beside them. The old Chevrolet waited at the edge of the lot, paint dulled by years of sun and rain, one side mirror chipped, a blanket of red dust softening the plate. The passenger door creaked as it opened, a sound so ordinary no one noticed, yet it stirred something half asleep inside the truck's darkened cab. Rowan bent down, held the door, then stepped aside. Ash stood just behind him, not hesitant, not eager. His eyes scanned the inside like mapping an old route, every step deliberate, as if each bone remembered the weight of caution. Without being told, Ash climbed in. No leap, no scramble, just a careful lift of one leg, then another, curling into the narrow space between the dashboard and the passenger seat. He tucked in quietly, like someone returning to a place that once knew the shape of his body, a place where engine sounds had once synced with the beat of days before it all fell apart. Rowan closed the door, circled around, slid into the driver's seat. The engine gave a tired growl, protesting time, then settled into a low, weathered hum. He didn't turn on the radio, didn't speak, just glanced over. Ash lay still, head resting on the base of the seat, eyes half closed, as if not quite ready to believe. The road home unspooled in silence. Cold wind slipped through the cracked window, whispering past the fissures in the dashboard. Burnt fields drifted by, patchy dirt trails, rooftops held down by rust and memory. But it wasn't the landscape that thickened the air. It was the growing space between two beings, man and dog, each shaped by long stretches of silence that never needed a reason. Rowan tapped the steering wheel, then exhaled. He didn't know why he had stopped at Lot 47. Didn't know what made him raise his hand. But right now, right here, on a gravel road leading back to a quiet farmhouse outside town, he knew something clearer than anything else. He wasn't alone in the cab. And maybe, just maybe, he had never truly left the war he thought he'd survived. Ash, still nameless, lay there, motionless, yet undeniably present. Like a fragment of an old memory, pulled gently back through the dust of what was left behind. Rowan's cabin sat tucked along the hillside, nearly 40 minutes from town, far enough that the nights came with the tap of insects at the window panes, and quiet enough that the wind could touch every single leaf without being interrupted by sirens or voices. It smelled of pine, of dry timber, and of the kind of oldness that hadn't yet been sorted into memories. Ash was led through the front door. He didn't hesitate. He didn't sniff corners. He didn't creep as dogs do when stepping into an unfamiliar home. He walked straight down the hall, stopped in the middle of the living room, where a worn rug sat crooked beneath a scarred wooden table, and lay down. Not curled, not tilted, just stretched out, spine straight, like a shadow too tired to react anymore, too accustomed to stillness to pretend otherwise. Rowan placed a bowl of water by the edge of the rug. Later, he opened a can of dog food and poured it into a ceramic bowl, one that had once belonged to a creature no longer around. The scent of chilled meat filled the air. Ash glanced at it once, his eyes skimming over it like someone passing a memory too faint to hold on to. Then he turned his head away. No tail wag, no whimper. The evening unfolded like a reel in slow motion. Rowan switched on a small lamp near the armchair, opened a technical manual he hadn't finished from the week before, but his eyes kept drifting back to the body on the rug. The clock ticked steadily, and firelight from the hearth stretched long shadows across the walls. Ash, still there, did not change position once. By midnight, Rowan pulled a thin blanket over himself and turned off the light. He didn't command, didn't coax, just looked back once before retreating into the bedroom. Even with the wooden door left slightly ajar, he could feel the presence, silent, undefined, like a void that had just been filled by quiet. Outside, the wind scraped gently along the siding. Inside, Ash lay as he had before, eyes not fully closed, ears slack, breath even, as if counting seconds with no expectation of change. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't fear. It was the existence of something that had once been forced to halt and learned to survive only from the edges. Morning came carefully. Pale sunlight slipped between the shutters, laying soft yellow stripes across the floorboards, still clinging to the night's mountain chill. Rowan woke before 7, not by alarm, but by years of military rhythm embedded deep in his bones. But today, time wasn't what stirred him. It was the silence, a strange, unnatural stillness. He stepped from the bedroom, adjusting his collar, eyes falling to the living room floor. Ash still lay there, same place, same position, unchanged. No sign of sleep, no shift in posture. A stillness that wasn't peace, but survival instinct worn smooth by loss. Rowan refilled the food, changed the water, stepped onto the porch and lit a cigarette, but his gaze kept drifting inside. To Ash, who stared not at him, but through the window, unfazed by light bouncing off glass, unmoved by dust motes dancing in the air. Most dogs would explore. Sniff. react to sounds, clinking dishes, shifting shadows. Ash did none of that. He hadn't stepped outside, hadn't once clicked a claw against the floor, hadn't rushed to any door. He just watched, with a precision that wasn't born of curiosity, but of training. Every time Rowan crossed the frame of a door, Ash turned his head. Not fast, not slow, but timed. Then, once, as Rowan walked down the hallway toward the back of the house, he turned unexpectedly, and found Ash already standing at the corner, as though he'd calculated every move before it happened. No sound, no chase, just arrival. Timed to the second. Rowan dropped a glass in the kitchen, on purpose, a loud, sharp crack. Ash flicked an ear, didn't bark, didn't flinch, didn't dive for cover like a skittish pet. He turned, walked to the doorway, stood, waiting, assessing the environment. Something in Rowan tightened. That behavior, he'd seen it before, not from pets, not from backyard companions, but from something trained, something that remembered precision as a necessity, not a trait. A muscle memory that once meant more than mere survival. Rowan stared, eyes fixed on Ash's spine, a line curved like a drawn string. His heartbeat slowed. No questions, no commands. He knew. This dog had once been built for something far greater. And great things don't always get peaceful endings. On the third night, rain came, not heavy, not enough to drown the creak of settling wood, but steady, just enough to make old memories seep through the cracks in the floor. Rowan sat at the kitchen window, a mug of black coffee cooling in his hand, eyes tracing the trails of rain that crawled down the glass. Ash lay a few steps away, head resting on crossed paws, eyes not on Rowan, but tilted toward the door, where the old truck sat, cloaked in water and shadow. He didn't move, didn't bark. Rowan leaned back, pulled open the side drawer, took out a weathered metal box, rectangle-shaped, edges dented, the color bleached with time. He opened it carefully, like it held something that could break. Inside, a photograph, faded at the corners. A younger man in uniform sat on white sand, hand resting on the back of a German shepherd, leaner than Ash, but with the same eyes. A name written faintly in the corner. Tango-2012-LZ-4. Rowan didn't touch the photo. He just looked. His jaw tightened. A single muscle on his cheek tensed, as if memory had nudged awake without permission. "I had one like you," he murmured, more to the air than anything. "Didn't bark much either. Didn't need orders." No response came. But Ash turned his head, slowly. His gaze met Rowan's. No affection, no distance, just presence. Enough to make the ache inside Rowan drift back to where it had always belonged. He swallowed, closed the box, set it back in the drawer. Then rose, walked toward the fireplace. In the firelight, Ash rose too, without being called, took his place on the rug, laid down, back turned to Rowan like a sentinel who didn't need sleep. Rowan sat, draped a blanket over his knees. Eyes never left that back. Some things don't need retelling, because they never left. They just changed shape, from desert blasts to breathing silence beneath a chair, from unsung deaths to the outline of a body unmoving beside flame. And sometimes, a dog doesn't come into your life to start something new, but to finish what was once broken. On Thursday morning, the hill lay under a blanket of gray clouds, heavy and unwilling to fold away. Rowan stood on the porch steps, a worn leash in hand, steam from coffee still lingering on his breath. Ash lay at the bottom step, eyes open, body slack as usual. But nothing about that stillness ever truly spoke of ease. "Want to go?" Rowan asked, his voice low, uncertain if the dog would respond. He lowered the leash, didn't tug, just let it drop near Ash's paws and turned. 7 seconds later, the soft scrape of claws touched the wooden floor. Ash stood. No prompting, no wagging tail. He simply followed. Each step matched Rowan's. Never ahead, never behind. The narrow trail behind the house cut through fallen leaves and fractured stone. Rowan walked ahead, letting Ash set the pace. But after a few steps, he began to notice. Ash didn't move like a dog out for a walk. He didn't poke his nose into shrubs or dart at phantom squirrels. At every bend, Ash paused, lifted his head, scanned both sides, and moved only when the next stretch was entirely visible. There was a sharp turn leading down to a dry creek bed. Ash stopped, stared into a dense patch of brush to the right. Then, with no sound, shifted left, circling the potential dead zone like water flowing around a stone. Every movement smooth, silent, precise. Rowan slowed, observing now with a trained eye. Ash walked the outer edge, hugging the high grass, always minimizing exposure. When the low rumble of a distant truck echoed from town, Ash folded his ears back, lowered his body, and positioned himself behind a thick tree, as if awaiting a command. Rowan froze. It was like watching a ghost of his own past. Midnight patrols, where every step had to dodge glass shards, where every glance could mean survival. At an old oak near a fork in the forest, Ash raised his head. His eyes landed briefly on a weathered sign nailed to a fence. Private, no trespassing. He didn't linger, just glanced, and turned away. Rowan swallowed. His hand trembled as he let the leash slip through his fingers, allowing Ash to lead. He wasn't guiding anymore. Maybe he never had been. That afternoon, as mist clung to the roof in quiet droplets, Rowan made a decision to finally clean out the old shed behind the cabin. A place where things went not to be thrown away, but to be forgotten gently. Wooden crates stacked by year and reluctance, each covered in webs and rust-scented silence. Ash didn't follow him in. He stood just outside the threshold, still as a soldier posted at the edge of camp. Rowan didn't call him. He understood. Some instincts need no explanation to keep their distance. From beneath a pile of cracked chains and greasy manuals, Rowan pulled out a battered tin box. Inside, a collar. Thick leather, seams double-stitched, a bronze buckle worn dull by time. It wasn't like the collars he'd used for family dogs. It was built for something tougher. A ridge lined the underside, raised subtly, as if something had once been hidden there. Rowan sat on a wooden stool, took out a utility knife, slit the inner lining with the delicacy of a man opening a wound. A faint snip. Then a tiny plastic chip, wrapped in grime and time, slid into view. Warped edges. Dust clinging like memory. He held it to the yellow light, squinting. The serial was mostly scratched. A few characters remained. No name, no unit. But the embossed code in the corner, the military mark, froze him. He laid the chip on the table, leaned back, laced his fingers. On his left wrist, a crescent scar throbbed faintly, the one torn by steel during an equipment teardown in enemy territory. That old pulse of knowing returned, whispering like a ghost. This wasn't just a lost dog. Rowan bowed his head, reached into his shirt pocket, pulled out the cloth rag he always carried, wrapped the chip, placed it in the drawer beneath the bench, not to hide it, but to buy himself time. Time to remember everything he'd once buried. Ash, still at the door, didn't move, didn't turn away. He stood like he knew. The collar hadn't been found. It had been returned. That night unraveled like time running backward. Wind moaned at the windows. Rain scratched the tin roof in steady pulses. The fireplace cast flickering flames against the ceiling, glowing like reels of old film catching fire. Rowan lay on the couch, legs stretched, one arm across his forehead. A military-issue blanket covered him, but the chill didn't come from the mountain air. It came from inside. The dream struck without warning. No images, just scent, burnt dust, charred meat, singed leather. Sounds followed, sharp, gritty, metal clashing. Breath gasping through radios, orders stuttering between bursts of gunfire and breaking earth. Then a face, not whole, just the edge. A square jaw, straight nose, dark eyes, and a shape beside him, smaller, quicker, 4 legs slicing through fire, a red tongue lolling from a snarling mouth. "Get out of there! He's still inside!" "No, you can't go back! Fall back!" Rowan shot upright. Sweat ran down his temple. His shirt clung to his back. Breath shallow. Fingers clenching the edge of the blanket like gripping a foxhole's rim. The fire had burned low. Only moonlight now, casting shadows across the floor. He turned his head. Ash was there, sitting at the center of the room. Not asleep. Not lying down. Just watching. Eyes glowing gold in the half-light. Not leaving Rowan's face. And Rowan knew. That gaze had held him all night. Still catching his breath, he slid onto the floor, sitting across from Ash. One hand pressed to his brow, the other limp at his side. After a long silence, he spoke. "Tango. Never came back." Ash didn't react. But the eyes stayed. Still. Waiting. Like a statue carved from the patience of unfinished goodbyes. Rowan dropped his gaze. The images returned, not like a memory but a flood. A battlefield of scorched sand, shouts broken by static, a dog sprinting through fire to lie beside his collapsing body. Then, that last look, before everything went black. He had locked that memory in a steel box in his mind. Buried it under 5 years of labor, 3 house moves, and 1,000 bolts and circuits. But now, when Ash looked at him with that same, unmistakable knowing, Rowan understood. Some wounds don't need reopening. They come back when someone quiet enough listens. And Ash, not anyone else, was the unfinished draft of a farewell that had never been said. Willow Glen stretched across the valley like a quiet pause on roads long abandoned by time. A town with a bakery that opened just 3 days a week, a red brick church whose bell had never been replaced, and a small veterinary clinic tucked beside the woods, its weathered sign swinging lazily in the breeze. Arlen and Paws, we fix more than bones. Rowan pulled up to the curb, tires crunching softly over loose gravel. Ash sat still in the back seat, unmoving. His eyes stayed locked on the green-painted cabin ahead, where wood smoke curled gently from a chimney, and a single window hung open. Lavender, dried and forgotten, swaying on its hook. The door opened before Rowan could knock. June Arlen stepped out, white coat draped over dark wool, silver hair tied low, her small frame always looking as if it were ready to leap from a swivel chair to bandage something broken with 4 legs and no words. Her face was smooth, but her eyes belonged to someone who had watched both life and death pass through without ever flinching. Someone who'd once caught the final breath of those who couldn't speak for themselves. "Rowan Beck," she said, half smiling. Not joy, not indifference, just recognition. "How long has it been since you called me the last breath of 4-legged ventilators?" Rowan rubbed the back of his neck. "Nearly 6 years." June tilted her head, eyes flicking toward the truck. "That one? Yours?" "Not sure. Maybe no one's," Rowan said, holding out his hand. Resting in his palm was a chip. Clean now, but unmistakably old. Found this inside his collar. June narrowed her eyes, taking the rice-sized fragment between fingers used to slicing stitches and resetting bones. I've got an old scanner, can't promise anything, but come in. The clinic held a single stainless steel table at its center. The air carried a faint scent of antiseptic. The walls were dotted with faded photos of animals long gone, some curling at the edges, yellowed with age. Rowan said nothing. He stood behind her as she bent over the console, fingers tapping commands into a CRT monitor whose green glow pulsed faintly like an old heartbeat. I remember you used to pull chips from K9s during debriefs, June muttered, still focused. Now you bring one to me. Guess that's how the circle closes, huh? Rowan didn't answer. He stared at the screen as it began to flicker, lines of code crawling slowly across the surface. And then, something in his chest slowed. The scanner let out a dry, single beep. The monitor glitched. Then the data began to emerge, fragmented, sluggish, like something returning from a place it had no business coming back from. June pulled her chair closer, glasses tight against her nose, fingers tracing the fields as they filled in. Rowan didn't blink. Chip code, TX-A402-C77 registry owner. Blank species, Canis lupus familiaris, German Shepherd registered name, Bravo training, ID, RSD-K9-1182, chip embedded, by K. Mercer. Record, status, closed/access denied. System note, subject assigned to unidentified operational group. Record suppressed by directive on March 17, 2019. Extended access restricted. June stopped, her hand lifted from the mouse. Her eyes held the line of text still glowing. Bravo. She whispered the name, not in awe, but with reverence, like speaking aloud something that had waited too long to be heard. That's a training name, not a pet's. Rowan's fists clenched, his shoulders dipped slightly, the veins in his wrist bulged. So it's real. Registered by K. Mercer. June looked back. That name ring a bell? Rowan nodded slowly. Cade Mercer, Special Forces. Went MIA during an op in 19. Nobody. Case got shelved as pending verification and disappeared. June braced herself on the table, her eyes sharpened. If that's true, then this dog never belonged in the civilian system, and showing up in a public auction like that, that's not just a red flag, that's a cover blown. Rowan's voice dropped. It happened before. A few K9s, when their handlers went dark, they were labeled no longer of operational value. Nobody knew who signed the orders. They just vanished. June stared at the line of code blinking slowly at the bottom of the screen. Extended access unavailable. She typed in another override. A new window opened. A faded logo appeared, the security seal of a third-party contractor. Her voice dropped. This isn't federal, not even official trainers. This is black contract infrastructure, the kind you don't admit to funding. Rowan stiffened. Mission scrubbed? June didn't answer right away. Then she shut the monitor off, turned to him. You're standing in a story people tried very hard to bury, and that dog is living evidence. The room felt smaller, though neither of them moved. The antiseptic air changed, thickened, like memory awakened something weighty in every corner. June crossed to an old file cabinet, pulled out a folder, laid it on the table. Inside, printed documents, yellowed charts, grayscale photographs. I worked with a research team after retiring from my unit. They rewrote the K9 training protocols for a private security program. No names were listed, but I remember the data. Rowan leaned closer. One photograph. A German shepherd charging across a ridge of sand, ears sharp, eyes locked on something just outside frame. The gate was Ash's. Not therapy, not explosives. Bravo was trained for autonomous operations, tactical decision-making in shifting field conditions. No commands, no hand signals. He didn't follow humans. He cooperated as an equal. June tapped the image. I saw a video once. Bravo, or one just like him, broke a perimeter, distracted a flank, then circled back to protect a wounded teammate. The eyes, they weren't reacting. They were processing. Rowan's knuckles whitened. You mean, he thinks? Not like we do, but enough to know when to hide, when to strike, when to wait, and most of all, when he isn't allowed to die. She met his gaze. If this is Bravo, he didn't get dumped, he escaped, and if that's true, someone, somewhere still wants him back. Rowan said nothing. Wind rustled the coarse curtain beside the window. It made a sound like forest leaves brushing against a tent, familiar, soft, and deeply unsettling. June rested a firm hand on his shoulder. I've seen animals carry wounds heavier than any human could, but Bravo, he's not just wounded, he's a witness. And witnesses aren't left alone for long? Rowan nodded, slowly, heavily. Outside, the truck still sat. Ash still waited, body still, eyes fixed on the distant tree line, like a soldier on watch, still not ready to go home. Night in the hills of Selwood never truly turned black. The moon always managed to hang just above the old treetops, casting silver light onto rooftops, exhaling smoke from slow-burning hearths. The November cold wasn't brutal, but firm enough to harden the soil, sharp enough that the wind cutting through the door cracks became the only sound threading sleep together. Rowan slept lightly. The dreams of war didn't come often anymore, but an undisturbed night was still a rarity. He turned, one arm draped across his forehead, breath syncing with the ticking of the wall clock. The fire had faded to a soft orange glow. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and sagebrush from the eastern fence. Ash lay at the foot of the bed, his usual post. No leash, no command, just presence, steady, instinctual. Then, around 3 a.m., when silence thickened like a wool blanket across the sleeping town, Ash jolted upright. No growl, no whimper, just stillness, then sudden alertness, ears pricked, eyes locked on the front door. Something had triggered a sense no human could name. A second later, he moved, pads tapping lightly across the wooden floor. He reached the door. Weight shifted forward. Rowan wasn't fully awake yet, but the subtle creak of wood under Ash's frame pulled his eyes open. Before he could speak, Ash let out a low, guttural growl, deep and restrained. Then, without hesitation, he launched forward. The latch gave out. The door swung open. Ash vanished into the cold night. Rowan sat up fast, heart beating against his ribs as the wind swept into the room. He threw on a jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and chased the trail of wet paw prints gleaming across the porch. At the far end of the dirt path, just past the frost-tipped lawn where moonlight hit like a spotlight, Ash was crouched beside a collapsed figure near the fence line. It was Mrs. Margaret, the elderly neighbor who often brought him baked goods on weekends. Her silver hair was wild with leaves, her thick sweater clinging to the damp earth, and her hand trembled in a failed attempt to move. Ash was whimpering now, nudging her face, licking her cheek, as if trying to coax life back into her. Rowan dropped beside her, checking her pulse. Weak. Her lips had turned pale from the cold. A bruise swelled on her temple, likely from a fall. No sign she'd called for help. He dialed emergency services with urgency. When the medics arrived, Ash still hadn't moved, positioned like a sentinel, guarding her until the first blanket was laid and the pulse confirmed. One cold night. one quiet salvation. No signal, no command. And from that night on, the name Ash, once unspoken, began to circulate like a miracle. 2 days after the midnight rescue, Selwood began to hum with a buzz that wasn't loud but undeniable, like someone had rung a bell deep in the community's heart. No one had seen what happened, except Rowan and Ash, but the story moved like mountain wind, quiet, steady, and unstoppable. The Selwood Gazette ran a special issue that Monday. Front page headline, "Unnamed Dog Saves Elderly Woman in Cold Night, a Hero in the Hills." Below was a candid photograph. Ash lying beside a hospital bed, his head resting on Mrs. Margaret's wrist, an IV trailing behind her, his eyes locked onto the lens, calm, watchful, as if standing guard without ever being told. The article was under 600 words. But it sparked something. Thank you letters, social media posts, comments from places far beyond Selwood, unusual traffic for a paper mostly known for classifieds and obituaries. Rowan didn't want the attention. He had never been the kind to put his private life under a spotlight. But this time, he couldn't stop it. A regional radio station called to request an interview. An animal rights group wanted to present a 4-pawed hero certificate. A pet supply store shipped a care package, thermal blankets, gourmet treats, and a custom-engraved collar. Ash, the Guardian. Rowan read the emails, the missed calls, the voicemails left on his machine. He said nothing, didn't protest, didn't lean in. But one message he couldn't ignore. An email with no subject, no body text, just an attached audio file. File name, Echo 17, katemercer.wav. He opened it in the small room behind the kitchen. Ash lay beneath his feet, as always. A woman's voice filled the air, low, composed, but unmistakably familiar. "You don't know me, but I know Ash, and I knew Cade Mercer. If you still have the chip, if you've ever heard of Project Sentry, then it's time we talked. My name is Claire Rhodes. I'm a journalist, and I believe you're holding a piece of the truth they tried to bury." Rowan froze, fingers clenched around the mouse. Ash lifted his head. Nothing was said between them, but in the hum of the desktop fan and the slow, steady rhythm of Ash's breathing, something began to shift. The call came in late afternoon, just as Rowan finished the last drop of coffee from the pot. The number wasn't local, no familiar area code. He hesitated, then picked up. "Rowan Beck?" The voice was female, steady, not asking. "Speaking." His eyes flicked to Ash, sunlight warming the ridge of his back where he lay near the window. "I'm Claire Rhodes, freelance journalist. I've written for Watchline Veteran Affairs, Grey Point Files. I cover off-ledger security projects, the kind with names but no files." Rowan's grip on the mug tightened. "That article about Ash," she continued, "it wasn't really about the dog. It was about you, a recluse, a dog like no other. Then, suddenly, a life-saving act that read more like muscle memory than accident. The people saw a touching story." Rowan leaned against the counter. "And what do you see?" "I see remnants of Project Sentry," Claire said flatly. "A semi-autonomous K9 infiltration and data retrieval program. Funding cut, wiped from records after the disappearance of one operator, Cade Mercer." The name hit like a stone-breaking surface tension. "I have leaks," Claire continued, "medical logs, flight manifests, audio transcripts of encrypted transmissions between Alpha Echo headquarters and an undisclosed field station, all pointing to a K9 named Bravo, matching the one at your feet." Rowan glanced down. Ash was staring at him, alert, too alert. "What do you want?" Rowan asked. "I want the truth," Claire said. "Not to expose it, to compare it. I have the pieces. You have the rest. If I'm right, Bravo isn't just a dog. He's a witness, and possibly a target." A cold wave crept down Rowan's spine. "They're looking for him?" "I don't know," Claire admitted. "But once the story hits the public eye, those who buried it won't stay quiet. If you don't find them first, they'll come for you." Long silence. "Meet me," Claire said. "No mics, no recorders. I'll bring you the original data. Names, photos, redacted orders, and Cade Mercer." Wind knocked gently against the window. Ash didn't blink, still watching. "Where?" Rowan asked. Night draped Selwood Ridge in a dense shade of gray, like ash sweeping across the hills from a fire no one had seen. The wind slid through the old pine limbs circling the house, carrying the scent of resin, damp earth, and faint hints of burned brush from the southern valley. Rowan remained awake, seated alone at his desk by the wide window. On the wood-grain surface lay the printouts from Claire Rhodes' email, half-read, beside an old county map marked with red lines connecting distant, seemingly unrelated points that somehow spoke the same language. Ash rested beneath the window, chin on his forepaws, relaxed in posture but not in truth. His ears kept twitching every time the wind changed rhythm or a strange creak echoed from the porch door. Not startled. Just aware. Close to midnight, a sound whispered through the dark. Faint, like metal kissing wood, soft enough that only a trained ear would catch it. Ash stood, instantly, no bark, no growl. He aligned his weight forward and glided toward the front door like he was answering a signal no human could hear. Rowan looked up, squinting. He grabbed the flashlight and cracked the door open. Ash stood on the top step, eyes locked on the wooden gate 15 meters away, the old boundary between his property and the dirt path leading to the creek. The flashlight beam swept toward the gate and stopped. There, embedded halfway into the weathered wood, was a small object, about the size of a fingertip, slanted, metallic, unfired, a 9mm round. Rowan approached. Ash shadowed him without a sound. He plucked the bullet free with the edge of his fingernail and turned it under the light. No scratch marks, no rifling, no impact damage. Not fired, not spent. It wasn't there by accident. It was there for a reason. A message. Rowan scanned the tree line. Black trunks frozen in place, mist hovering over the grass, no footprints in the dirt. But the wind had shifted. And from the way Ash tilted his head, the breeze wasn't coming from the mountains. It was coming from the town. "They're not giving up," Rowan muttered. Ash said nothing, just looked at him, eyes sharp like a blade freshly whetted. Rowan set the bullet on the desk beside the still-spread map. He stared at it for a long while. It hadn't been fired, no noise, no intent to wound, just presence. An object with no explanation but all the meaning in the world, enough to slow the blood. He didn't ask who, because deep down he already knew. The sender didn't need to appear, didn't need to break locks, didn't need to steal a thing, just had to place a single bullet, right spot, right time, right angle, and wait. Rowan stepped onto the porch, switching on the perimeter lights. Long beams swept over gravel and woodline. He walked the usual watch points, the creek bend, the overgrown rose brush, the rotting lumber pile behind the shed. No footprints, no break in the brush. Ash stayed close, silent. He didn't sniff wildly like a tracking hound. He moved in a controlled arc, left, then right, tightening a perimeter like someone tracing an invisible breach. Rowan backed against the truck, eyes on the forest's edge. The cold climbed from his gut, not from the weather, but from a certainty. He was being watched, not by hikers, not by curious locals, but by someone who left no boot prints, no phone signals, no camera glitch. Someone who had learned to disappear. Like him, or like the ones who had trained Ash. Rowan returned inside, locked every window. He opened the cabinet beneath the stairs and pulled out an iron case. Inside, a Colt .45, spare magazines, and a military-issued night vision scope, last used at the Laredo Forward Operating Base. He wiped the gun clean. Slow, methodical, like a craftsman who never wanted to use his tools again, but always kept them sharp. On the desk, the bullet remained. Small, silent, but loud in its meaning. "We know you have it." Rowan no longer doubted. This wasn't instinct, wasn't paranoia. This was targeted surveillance, and whoever was behind it was waiting to see what he would do next. The wind shifted again, this time from the south, town side. It carried a dry, stale scent. Paper, printer toner, industrial cleanser. The smell of boardrooms where life and death signatures were made by hands that never touched blood. Rowan stood on the porch, leather jacket draped across his shoulders, one hand on the railing. Ash beside him. Not guarding, not resting. Just ready. In the field, a shift in wind meant smoke was coming your way. It meant time to hide was over, time to move. Rowan didn't build fences, didn't dig traps, didn't call for backup. Instead, he cleared the table. Pinned every page of the Project Sentry file to the wall. Scans, satellite prints, redacted orders. A web of silence now strung into a visual reckoning. At the center, he hammered a nail. And on that nail, he hung the bullet. Not to fear it. Not to forget it. But to remember exactly what kind of language it spoke. The next day, he drove into town. Walked into the Selwood post office. Mailed a sealed package to Claire Rhodes. No digital trace, no copy kept. Inside, a scan of Ash's chip, the readout from June's vet scanner, and a single handwritten note. "If I disappear, it wasn't by choice." That evening, he reloaded the Colt. Cleaned every smear of oil, not to fire, but to remember he was still living in a war that refused to stay buried. When dusk returned, he opened the front door. Ash was already up. No call, no leash, just standing, eyes fixed on the winding dirt path ahead. No orders, no plan, just resolve. The wind carried faint noises from beyond the ridge, truck engines, a distant train horn, the dry scrape of pine needles. But in Rowan's mind, only one thing lingered. The silence had gone on long enough. He took a breath. Not to retreat, but to begin. Morning passed in threads of dry wind and the steady drip of coffee into a ceramic cup. Rowan sat at the kitchen table, eyes fixed on his laptop screen. A new message from Claire Rhodes had appeared in his inbox. No subject, just a compressed file and a single line of text. This is what they left behind. Not much, but enough to make the old wounds bleed. He opened the folder. The images loaded slowly, grainy frames, pulled from helmet cams or covert observation equipment. Each one carried the distortion of dust, sweat, and distance. Then one photo made his finger pause on the trackpad. A soldier, kneeling in desert sand, hand gripping a backpack strap. His helmet was pushed back, face tanned and hollow-eyed but sharp, uniform coated in grit from collar to kneecap. The name patch on his chest, barely legible through the dust, read, K. Mercer. And beside him, undeniably, without needing to zoom in, stood a German shepherd. Forward posture, ears high, eyes locked in alertness, dark coat, a familiar scar on the left ear. Bravo. There was no date stamp, but the terrain was unmistakable. The jagged hills of the Masson Range, a former combat zone nearly 6 years ago. Behind them, armored vehicles, tent flaps, a plume of smoke on the horizon. Claire had included a redacted report snippet. Agent Cade Mercer, Joint Operations Unit Bravo Echo, declared missing in action during field operation April 2019. No body recovered. Unit dissolved. Associated asset, K9 Bravo, not documented in retrieval manifest. Rowan reread it. No remains, no ceremony, just a name erased from a system, and a dog no one ever came to reclaim. The next photo was blurrier, likely from drone footage. Same place, same man, same dog. But now Cade stood, back to the camera, map in hand. Bravo beside him, no leash, no hand signal, just two silhouettes, man and dog, walking away from the lens into land no one ever returns from. And that was the image. That chilled Rowan deeper than any data. Cade hadn't died the way others died. He vanished, like a line deleted without explanation. And the dog beside him was now asleep at Rowan's feet, eyes half closed. Rowan said nothing. The screen still glowed, casting faint light across his face, deepening the lines that came from knowing things people aren't meant to know. He shifted, rotated the screen slightly, angling it toward Ash, who lay near the table, head resting on his forepaws, dozing. And the moment the photo's light passed across the screen, Ash opened his eyes. No jump, no bark, just attention. His gaze locked onto the screen like a silent circuit had just been triggered somewhere deep beneath the surface. Rowan saw it immediately. The shift didn't come from movement, but from the eyes. Ash blinked. Slowly, then stopped. Then widened, pupils dilating like light responding to a battlefield flash. His nose lifted, not to sniff, but to seek a scent imprinted on a level no human could measure. The smell of hot sand, of engine oil, of the sweat of the man who once held his leash through hell. Rowan printed the photo. Color copy. Slow hum of the inkjet filled the room. He placed the paper gently on the wooden floor, just beyond arm's reach from Ash. No words. Ash stood. Deliberate, measured, not like a dog approaching food or play, but like a soldier approaching a memory. He moved towards the photo, lowered his head. Didn't blink. Eyes fixed on Cade Mercer's face. A breath escaped Ash's muzzle, so soft it could have been mistaken for wind under a door. Then, a step forward. A whine, drawn from the chest, deep, cracked with dust and distance. Not a sound of need, not a sound of pain. A call, half dream, half recognition. Rowan froze. Ash sat, his front paw touching the photo's edge, his head tilted, eyes scanning every pixel as if searching not for the image, but for the person who should have been standing there. Then, gently, deliberately, Ash licked the photograph, right where Cade's name sat on the shoulder patch. Rowan lowered beside him, placed his hand on Ash's back, and for the first time since the day he brought him home, he felt the tremor, not from fear, but from something inside unraveling. Ash lay down, positioning himself beside the photo, head pressed near its edge, eyes wide open. He didn't blink, didn't sleep. He simply watched, guarding a man who still hadn't come home. The computer screen flickered steadily as Claire Rhodes zoomed into an archived article pulled not from Google, not from any mainstream search engine, but from a standalone server housing stories once withdrawn from circulation due to security concerns. She sat in a weathered coffee shop on the outskirts of Bridgewater, back against the wall, eyes locked on paragraphs yellowed by digital decay. Noise-canceling headphones framed her face, yet sound still wove its way in. The clink of a spoon against ceramic, the low mechanical groan of the coffee grinder, the wind brushing past thin glass, all of it creating the kind of ambient murmur Claire needed to stay focused. The article's headline read, "Sentry, the Ghost Protocol?" Byline: A. Moreland, investigative journalist, marked missing July 2020. Access logs, blocked by 3 separate defense content agencies. Claire scrolled slowly, reading every line with the precision of someone who'd waited too long for a breadcrumb trail to finally appear. Project Sentry, according to leaks from a joint contract between 3 private military contractors, was an initiative to develop micro-infiltration tools using biological units, specifically trained canines, K9S, designed to operate as active agents in regions where official military presence was unauthorized. She typed into her notes, "Tactical dogs without unit code. Stateless." The selected K9s were not chosen merely for physical capability. They were subjected to neurological conditioning threefold above standard thresholds, trained with proprietary signal language, unencrypted behavioral pattern recognition, and the capacity to operate entirely without human command. An embedded image surfaced, grainy, nearly lost to compression. Claire enlarged it. It was a schematic diagram. 3 nodes converging on a central operations hub labeled Echo Node. At the base, handwritten in ink, Cade Mercer, Handler, Bravo, K9 Tactical. Her heartbeat picked up. She hit Save. Just beneath the article's final paragraph, a faint, hastily written postscript appeared, as if the author knew this might be the only copy to survive. "If you're reading this, I never made it to print, and if I've disappeared, open the file, echovault0.json. This project was never experimental. It was deployed, and some units never returned." Claire straightened, lips pressed, hands trembling faintly, but her eyes sharpened like a scalpel. This was no longer theory, no longer whispered rumor. Project Sentry existed. It operated. And someone never came home. She minimized the article and opened the final attachment, echovault0.json, a data file encoded in a hybrid structure typical of highly classified internal technical documents. She activated raw read mode, unlocking each layer manually. The first lines appeared garbled, ID strings, campaign acronyms, military grid coordinates. But once keyword triggers activated, a block of stripped syntax emerged with clarity, sharp as a switchblade. Objective function, TRI, Tactical Reconnaissance Infiltration. Deployment subject, K9 unit, Bravo/Echo type, unregistered handler affiliation. Theater, outside internationally recognized boundaries, non-jurisdictional operational zones. Purpose, recon, tracking, embedded sensors/remote trigger access nodes. Claire paused. Then came the line that made her stomach turn cold, a sentence that sliced through years of exposure as if her skin had thinned. Advantages, no insignia, no identity, no negotiations. If intercepted, classified as feral animal, not under national military protection. She read it again. This time, slower. The dogs, once symbols of loyalty, protection, and service, had been transformed into deniable biological assets by the minds behind Project Sentry. They weren't just scouts. They were keys, soft entry points into unacknowledged war zones where human soldiers could not tread without sparking diplomacy or law. No visa, no code names, no escorts. Creatures like Bravo had been crafted to pass through locked gates, gather intelligence, then vanish without question. Claire typed, K9s as soft breach units, no ID, no accountability, terminated upon control loss, capable of autonomous mobility/adaptation, undetectable because dogs are not filed as personnel. Below was a flow diagram, red lines branching from a command node toward a cluster of shaded gray zones, unmapped regions absent from official military charts, yet marred by civilian reports of detonations, firefights, and unexplained damage. At the end of the chart, Masson Ridge, April 2019. Claire didn't need confirmation. That was where Cade Mercer had reportedly fallen, and that was also the last known field appearance of Bravo, now called Ash, under the designation of a non-existent unit. She removed her headphones. The cafe's ambient light dimmed with afternoon gold. It spilled over her empty glass, casting pale reflection across the laptop screen, which now displayed only a final string of text. A raw system note, no official header, buried among command calls, written by someone inside for someone else who knew. If unit control is lost or fails to return via protocol, initiate grayfold. No biological remnants. Prioritize on-site neutralization. Erase all linked data at origin. Claire highlighted the phrase, grayfold. She cross-referenced her offline archive, years of leaks and silence, and found that term in only one other file. A report from Zone 9, a case where an elite contractor team vanished with 3 special K9s. No bodies, no distress signals, just a scorched outpost, wiped clean. No one ever found a dog. No one ever asked why. The final entry read, Grayfold executed. Perimeter cleared. Claire sat upright, her grip on the table edge tightened, knuckles whitening. There were things unwritten, but for someone like her, they didn't need to be. These dogs did not die of age, or illness, or war. They were silenced, surgically, completely, erased like inconvenient proof. Some were terminated after loss of control, some disappeared before the order arrived, and a few, very few, escaped. One of them was Bravo, or more precisely, Ash, the dog who was never on any repatriation list, but who was also never gray-folded. He had vanished, just like his handler, Cade Mercer. They had done the one thing no one planned for. They survived. Claire sat still, the dying sun cut across her shoulder. Her coffee cup remained untouched. The screen displayed only one final line, centered, blinking, like a breath taken too long ago. Ash is not the target. He is the system glitch, a glitch that learned how to breathe. The paper map stretched across the hood of the old Ford Bronco, its weathered folds slicing through state borders like long-healed scars. Claire circled each marked location in red, spots pulled from a fragmented internal veterinary database, the kind of places too small to register, too forgotten to be official. Each one had taken in a male German shepherd, scar behind the left ear, slight limp. Rowan nodded, folded the map, and slid it into the pocket of his worn leather jacket. They had no addresses, only names half erased by time. Cliffside Vet, San Marlo Animal Recovery, Station 12, near the old forest turn. None of them showed up on any GPS. None of them had ever existed officially. The car rolled out before sunrise. Ash had climbed in without needing a word. Claire took the passenger seat, tablet and notebook spread across her lap. Rowan kept his hands on the wheel, his eyes not worried but as if tracing memory to a place that no longer had a name. They crossed the first state line, past endless plains of dry grass, ghost farms leaning in the wind, and faded military warning signs posted along forgotten dirt roads. The first stop was a rescue shelter long since shuttered, broken glass, moss crawling up concrete walls, but Claire's records showed. 3 years ago, a dog had arrived. Very quiet, sat by the door for 2 days, then disappeared before anyone gave him a name. Ash stepped in slowly, nose scanning corners, but offered no clear response. Rowan watched in silence, something stubborn lingering behind his gaze. The kind of resolve found in men who keep looking for teammates, never declared dead. The second state was forest, deep, rocky, half-forgotten, a clinic built from repurposed shipping containers. The original vet had passed away, but locals remembered. A tall, lean man with a gray dog had come through. Said little, only asked for antiseptic and bandages. The way he'd placed his hand on the dog's neck, firm, controlled, almost panicked, left no one room to refuse. Claire took notes. Rowan didn't. They didn't speak of hope, didn't call these signs. They were bones, pieced together toward a body never buried. By dusk, they reached the third state. Through dust-caked windows, the setting sun lit up the worn-out sign, Cedarland Coastal Region Southgate Entrance. Ash stirred in the back seat. Not a growl, not a bark, just a quiet, fixed stare out the window, as if some old scent or heartbeat once tethered to him was drawing near again. Every clinic they stopped at shared one trait. They weren't places with fluorescent signs or reception bells. They were tucked behind gas stations, on the back slopes of hills, wedged between low-town homes. And inside them were people who didn't ask why, didn't demand pasts, people who only cared about breath, pulse, and the eyes, whether human or not. The first was Doctor. Ames. Animal relief. Only a young nurse remained after the doctor passed. When Claire showed her a photo of Ash and asked, "Have you ever seen a dog like this? Scar on the left ear, slight limp?" The girl nodded immediately. 3 years ago. Tall man, military jacket. Didn't say much, just said, "He needs meds, no receipts." I remember because the dog didn't look around. It sat by the door, back to the man, eyes on the entrance, like it was guarding. Rowan and Claire exchanged looks. Ash stood a few paces away, eyes fixed on the exam table. Tense, focused, still. The next was Blue Trail Vet. A tired, middle-aged man with messy hair and thick, round glasses greeted them with a gravelly voice. "Oh, that dog? I remember. Not for the scar, but for how he entered. No leash, no hesitation. He didn't sniff, didn't pace, just walked straight to the corner of the room and lay down, eyes wide open." Claire asked, "What about the man?" "Soldier, maybe. When I asked his name, he said, 'Just help the dog, I don't matter.' It was the first time I gave an antibiotic shot and felt examined, and not by the man, by the dog." Each stop added clarity, not just to a trail, but to a pattern. Bravo always entered first, picked a spot with full visibility, never turned his back to a door. At Glen Southfield, a mountain edge post, they met an old vet named Martha. She kept no records, but she remembered the eyes. "The man said the dog's name was Bravo. I thought it was a joke, but the way he said it, and the way the dog responded, quiet, firm, precise, I'd never seen anything like it. That dog took a needle without flinching, looked at me like, 'I know this is necessary, do it!'" Claire recorded every word. Rowan wrote nothing. But he watched Ash, and sometimes silence says everything. The scar behind the ear, the slight limp, the complete stillness in pain. They weren't just traits of a dog. They were a map, leading back to a man who didn't want to be found. Evening fell faster as they reached Cedarland, a small oceanside town tucked under pine-shadowed hills, its back to the land, its face toward the sea like someone who lives by storms and remembers each one. Waves lapped steadily, repeating like breath, calm, but never forgiving those who waited here too long. Claire traced the paper map, pointed toward a dirt road at the edge of town, where a blacked-out square still showed a faint, smudged name. Bayview Care. When they arrived, the wooden sign had lost its paint, the brass plaque worn to a whisper, but one hand-etched line still read, "We treat what others forget." Rowan killed the engine. Ash jumped out first. But this time he didn't move slow, didn't scan. He walked straight for the porch, like he remembered it. The on-duty vet was a silver-haired woman planting flowers in the yard. She looked up, saw Ash before she saw the people, and froze. "Impossible." Rowan approached. Claire followed, holding out the printed photo of Cade and Bravo. "Have you seen this dog before?" The woman didn't answer right away. She walked slowly toward Ash, who stood still, unflinching, not affectionate, not wary, Just waiting. She placed her hand gently on the side of Ash's neck, where the fur grew thinner from old stitches, and whispered, "Bravo." Rowan and Claire exchanged glances. The woman looked up, her voice steadier. "Last year, a man brought him in." Said nothing. Left arm injured, walked like he'd learned to live ready to run. Asked for help with a deep wound, refused paperwork, left $50, told me, "If anyone asks, I was never here." Claire asked, "Do you remember his face?" She answered without hesitation. "Not clearly. But he looked like someone who lives always half expecting to leave. I've seen many, but this one wasn't running from danger. He was running from memory." Rowan lowered his voice. "Where did he go?" "The docks. Asked for the old shipyard. It's just storage now, or maybe a hiding place." Rowan turned back to the car without another word. Ash had already turned his head toward that direction, ears up, eyes locked. He sensed something no one else could, something not written in files, not printed on maps, but buried in bone. The scent of someone who once called his name, without needing to command. Grayson Bay didn't exist on most modern maps. GPS systems labeled it a non-designated coastal region, and navigation tools showed nothing more than a shadowed strip of shoreline, lined with pines, no markers, no descriptions. Locals referred to it by older names: Dry Port, Blindman's Bay, or simply the place behind the ridge. The town had only one main road, paved in green slate, damp and uneven, running past abandoned warehouses, an unstaffed gas station, and a line of single-story timber houses with fading red tile roofs. A lone diner opened at 8 a.m. and closed whenever no one else showed up. Outside, an old blind man's fish cart still stood every afternoon, not for business, but as a living anchor marking the rhythm of a place that had no reason to change. Claire sat in the back seat, eyes scanning each shuttered storefront, and murmured, "It feels like the whole town is holding its breath for something." Rowan didn't respond. He was watching Ash, who now sat upright between the front seats, eyes locked on the road ahead, like he'd walked this path before, but not with Rowan. A sea breeze swept inland, thick with salt and dried kelp, wrapping around the air like an unshaken memory. The fog hadn't lifted. The day was bright, but carried no sunlight, and the town seemed to need no light to survive. If people still lived here, they passed each other in glances. No one looked for long. No one spoke first. They moved with the quiet of those who had once seen what should never have been seen, and learned how to go on by asking nothing more. On a rusted utility pole near the path leading to the dock, a rotted wooden sign hung loosely. "Grayson Bay, we don't forget, we don't explain." Claire took a photo. Rowan didn't slow down. Because here, what mattered wasn't written in words, didn't show on faces. It hid in the way a door took half a second longer to close, the hesitant shift of feet behind a curtain, or a fleeting glance from someone who knew too much and had chosen to let the truth fade with the morning fog. Grayson Bay was where people came to disappear, and if Cade Mercer had survived, there was no better place to become a man without a name. The fog slipped low, like a cold silk cloth, brushing the mossy stone road and threading through every warped plank of the forgotten warehouses. Rowan threw on another jacket, locked the steering wheel, and opened the car door. Instantly, the coastal wind swept in, carrying the broken clatter of loose tin sheets far off in the distance, not loud enough to warn, but too real to ignore. Ash leapt down first. He didn't sniff the ground, didn't scan his surroundings. His ears didn't track possible threats. He simply walked, with the steps of someone who already knew where the soul had gone. Rowan and Claire followed. No one called his name. No one asked where he was going. Sometimes the dog remembers more than memory does. Ash led them past a stretch of low palms, hugging the shoreline, where the sand dipped gently into dark rock, and decaying wooden pilings jutted out toward the waves like the bones of an old pier. Dozens of fishing boats sat still in the water, as if hibernating. An occasional clang of chain against hull echoed, a soft metallic rhythm, steady and distant, like the heartbeat of something still holding on. Then Ash stopped. No wasted movement. No looking back. He halted exactly in the middle of the weathered boardwalk leading to the main dock, where the fog thickened just enough to blur the end of the path like a hidden gate. Claire held her breath. Rowan stepped forward, but Ash moved one pace back, as if to say, "You don't need to go closer. Just look." And from within the dense gray veil, a figure began to form. Not tall, not fast, the gait uneven, shoulders bowed, but the shape was hauntingly familiar. Ash didn't bark, didn't run. He took a few steady steps, then sat, right in the center of the dock, as if a soldier had just found the commander he once thought lost. The man in the mist stopped. One hand moved to his chest pocket, his head lowered. Then he dropped to one knee. Both hands reached out, palms open toward Ash. No name called, no command given. Just a silence that expanded like a confession. Ash moved. Slowly, but surely. And when only half an arm's reach remained between them, he pressed his head against the man's chest. No one spoke. But Rowan understood. This was the end of a search that had rewritten itself in shadows, and the beginning of a storm of memory that had never truly ended. The room behind the old shipyard had no bed, no armchair, nothing but a makeshift wooden table, a few cans of soup strewn in the corner, and a pile of papers hidden beneath a dried paint bucket. Everything bore the traces of a life not built to settle, only to survive, quietly, invisibly. Rowan leaned against the wall, eyes locked on the man crouched over a small oil stove on the cracked cement floor. Claire sat curled near a window, cracked just enough to let the sea air in, her gaze never leaving the figure who had emerged like someone risen from the grave. That man, gray streaks already visible along his temples, fingers trembling slightly as he struck the lighter. But the eyes were sharp, like a blade wrapped in torn leather. Ash lay at his feet, head resting atop the man's worn boot, eyes half closed, not in deep sleep, but in the kind of guard stance held only for one person, the one who had once called him by his true name. "What's your name?" Claire asked, voice even. The man didn't look up. Logan Price. I mean your real name." His hand paused. Silence filled a few seconds. Then a nod. "Cade Mercer." No more denial. No more avoidance. Claire glanced toward Rowan, who had yet to speak a word since entering the room. His face carried a collision of emotion. Shock, recognition, disbelief, and something closer to anger. An anger born of a sacrifice no one had permission to speak of. Cade pulled out a folding chair, sat down, placed a hand on Ash's head, fingers tracing the outline of the scar behind the ear. "I buried Logan Price the first day I disappeared. That name, it was a body I needed, so Cade Mercer could vanish from every system." He looked up, gaze clear and unwavering. "I wasn't mortally wounded, but I saw too much, and I knew if I lived, Bravo would never be safe." Claire gave the smallest nod, not as a journalist, but as someone who had just confirmed the myth she'd chased for years was real. Rowan clenched his fists, pulled a cigarette from his pocket but didn't light it. He stared at Cade for a long time before his voice came out, low and rough. "So, all those years, you only lived to hide?" Cade gave a soft laugh. "I lived, so Bravo wouldn't be decommissioned like a broken weapon." Rowan remained where he was, his back against the damp cement, eyes studying every motion between Ash and the man named Cade Mercer. The man who had once been declared dead, scrubbed from every dossier, every war map, every late-night barrack story of the few who returned. But nothing in that old photograph Claire had shown him, nothing in the leaked documents labeled Project Sentry, could capture what now stood before him. Ash, once the silent shadow curled beside a fireplace, unmoved by toys, unwilling to eat under watchful eyes, now lay stretched beside Cade, head gently pressed against the fraying seam of a worn combat pant leg. This wasn't joy. Not the way ordinary dogs showed it. There was no jumping, no wild wagging. Only stillness, complete, absolute, the stillness of a soldier who had found his commanding officer. Rowan had seen that before, at outposts far beyond the lines, when a K-9 found someone it thought lost in the chaos of an ambush. No name needed, no command given. Just the scent of skin, the rhythm of breath, the echo of familiar footsteps. Bravo, Ash, had returned to the position he was born to hold, left flank, half a step back, close enough to react to breath, but never to block movement. And Cade, with eyes hollow from years, not tears, ran a hand down Ash's spine, like tracing a manuscript newly returned from Ash. Rowan swallowed hard. His fingers still clutched the unlit cigarette, lips pressed tight to cage the rising burn in his chest. He wasn't bitter. He didn't resent. But he knew that dog had never belonged to him. "You still waited for him?" Rowan said, voice hushed like the lingering smell of charred wood in the night. "Even when you didn't know he was alive?" Ash didn't lift his head, but one ear twitched, an unspoken yes. Claire didn't speak. The recorder under the table continued spinning, but her hands never reached for it. Some moments, any word feels like desecration. Cade bent down, rested his forehead gently against Ash's. One hand touched the base of the dog's neck, where once hung a collar stamped BRV-07. He whispered again, from somewhere older than language, "Good boy. You waited." Rowan turned his head, not to look away, but to give that moment room. For the two survivors of a storm, no one else could name. The stove's embers had cooled, and the dim light in the room faded with the slow descent of dusk over the bay. Cade sat motionless, hands interlocked, eyes on the concrete, not as avoidance, but as if choosing each word with the precision of someone disarming a mine, aware that one wrong syllable might ignite years of buried pain. "There are things I never meant to tell," he began, voice dry and measured like an internal debrief, slow, cold, but irrevocable. "I didn't go missing. I disappeared. After the ambush, the unit was torn apart. No backup, no extraction. We were left there, as if someone intended it." Rowan sat still, arms crossed. Claire leaned forward slightly, watching every muscle tense in Cade's face. "Bravo, Ash pulled me out of the wreckage, with his own teeth. He bit into my vest harness, dragged me over sand and rubble, dodging every round. His eyes never left mine, even when blood started leaking from his foreleg." He paused, breathed, steady but not detached. "When evac finally came, they took me. No space for the dog, no ID code in the system. I screamed, begged to take Bravo with me. But they said he was no longer necessary. And worse, they said if I survived and talked too much about something called Project Sentry, they'd ensure every loose end would be silenced." Claire lowered her voice. "Greyfold." Cade nodded. "I heard that code once, through comms just before our signal cut. I wasn't sure it was real, until I saw another K-9 unit BRV-03 lying on a dirt road with a surgical cut at the back of his head. No one came for the body." His hands tightened. just slightly, but enough for both of them to feel it. The fury that never left, only waited. So I did the only thing I could. I vanished, cut all ties, erased myself. And if Bravo survived, I knew he'd be processed, not with poison, but with something worse, stripping everything that made him who he was. He looked down again, directly at Ash, who still lay beside him, as if afraid that leaving his side once more might be permanent. I didn't disappear to live. I disappeared so he wouldn't be erased from this world like a training glitch. Rowan said nothing, but something in him shifted. Suspicion gave way to understanding, anger softened into acknowledgement, and perhaps respect, for a man who didn't run out of fear, but because it was the only way to keep the last living remnant of his own humanity from being erased. Night draped over the small room like a heavy blanket pulled across fragments of memory still gasping for air. The fire in the stove had long since died, leaving only a faint warmth lingering through the quiet. Claire turned on the recorder but placed it at a distance, never intruding on the kind of conversation that demanded space more than sound. Rowan sat angled beside the half-open window, fingers wrapped around a cup of cold coffee. Ash lay right at Cade's feet, still like a breathing stone. Cade lifted his head. His eyes weren't on anyone in the room, but locked onto the dark space in front of him, the same space where he had once buried a part of his soul. We were deployed late July. Saad region, 12 miles from the border. Mission name was Haven Mark, but the real content, no one ever spelled it out. We were told one thing only: approach, observe, don't intervene. From his jacket, Cade pulled a torn map, unfolding it across the battered wooden table, pencil marks still faintly visible, symbols, cross-circled zones, internal codes. I was the only one in our unit who knew there was a parallel force. Mercenaries funded privately, operating under a name that didn't officially exist. Project Sentry was its unofficial arm. He pointed to the map's edge. They inserted specialized K9 units, like Bravo, to shadow, record, track movement. But their true purpose was to mark targets in advance for extrajudicial disposal. No trial, no records. Cade paused, then went on. On the fourth night, we were ambushed, not by enemies, by Sentry's own embedded team. Someone in the chain had greenlit the deletion of our entire unit, called it a trajectory deviation. My team was torn apart piece by piece, no one left to retrieve. I lived because of Bravo. He shoved me out of the blast, dragged me over 200 meters through shifting sand. No rest, no food, no pause. He said nothing else. He simply sat, one hand resting gently on Ash's back, as if letting go might unravel the entire story into the night, like a dream fading at dawn. In that peeling room, with a stove now fading to ash, no judgment was issued, no title granted, but the silence, deep, long, and heavy as earth packed over a grave, was all the confirmation needed. Ash was here. Not a hallucination, not a memory reconstructed, not a dramatized symbol of grief. He had survived. And somehow, in a world built to erase what was no longer useful, Ash had made it out and returned to the ones who needed to know. Claire glanced at the dog curled beneath Cade's legs, head resting atop the worn boots, his body folded inward as if trying to preserve a warmth once lost. She spoke slowly, without needing to project her voice. There were leaked reports, witnesses, internal logs. She looked to Rowan. But nothing among them survived long enough to be believed. Rowan gave a small nod. Not in agreement, but as one who acknowledged what he had already known from the first time he met Ash. Some stories are not written in words. Some truths don't sit in files. They live in scars, in crooked gates, in eyes that no longer respond to toys. Ash didn't need to testify. He didn't need to explain. He only needed to exist, and his existence once dismissed as a flaw, a leak, a malfunction, now stood as the most undeniable accusation. Cade exhaled, not bothering to hide the rasp in his throat. I used to think I was the last one who remembered the truth, but turns out I was just the one who survived. He looked down at Ash. And he is the evidence. Off the shore, the waves beat a steady rhythm. Far out, the lighthouse swept its beam across the bay for the third time that night. And in that moment, there was no tribunal, no declaration, no decree. There was only a dog, still breathing. And the world, though it may never admit it, had just been awakened. Morning arrived late in Grayson Bay. Sunlight didn't pour through the windows. It merely crept, shy and filtered, through thick layers of mist like memories left tangled and unresolved. Rowan sat at the wooden table inside the low-ceilinged back room of the old shipyard. In front of him was a small iron box, one he had hidden beneath the truck ever since they left the first town behind. The box was rusted, its corners dented inward as if someone had once tried to crush it beneath a boot, not to open it, but to bury what it held. Claire stood opposite him, arms crossed, tension written plainly across her face. She had spoken to sources before, read the whispers in unconfirmed leaks, brushed close to the edges of so-called gray ops. But this was the first time a living piece of proof sat across from her. A man erased by the system. A dog priced and discarded like malfunctioning gear. Rowan didn't speak much. He simply laid his palm across the lid, then unlatched the small metal clasp. Inside was everything he'd salvaged, copies of strange emails, lines from digital journals recounting fragmented dreams, photographs blurred by water but still clear enough to show the numbered collar. BRV-07. One paper slip, its ink faded, described, Military Canine, Non-Verbal Reactive Model, Embedded with Autonomous Module. He tapped his finger along the edge of the box, an old habit from his days in the Army Tech Unit, like listening for the heartbeat of a device still clinging to life. Take it, he said, his eyes fixed on Ash, curled by the fireplace, back turned to them, as if none of it mattered anymore. Claire stared at Rowan for a long moment. What can I possibly protect? She asked quietly. You don't have to protect anyone, Rowan replied. Just speak the truth. All of it. She nodded, slowly, then opened her backpack and began placing the files inside, carefully, reverently, like someone collecting fractured bones to rebuild a skeleton. Not to exhume a death, but to return a name to the truth. From his inner jacket pocket, Rowan pulled out one final photo. He handed it to Claire, his voice low. No one's seen this before. Bravo, during his rookie training, sitting next to Cade. No trenches, no weapons, just sunlight, and the belief they'd both make it back. Claire accepted the photo. And for the first time on this long journey, she didn't feel like a reporter. She felt like a custodian, someone holding the last testimony of a soul that had never been heard. On the road back to the cabin, Claire sat in the back seat of the truck, arms wrapped tightly around the backpack, as if the wind might steal away its contents, those half-formed records, images, codes, things that, if lost to the roadside, would once again become just discarded scraps of paper. But now, for the first time, they carried something no dossier ever had before. Ash. The dog lay silent in the space between the front seats, his head resting on Rowan's leg, eyes closed, ears still in the quiet posture of a soldier standing watch. He didn't bark, didn't shift, didn't respond to the engine or the salt wind or the rattle of potholes. He simply breathed, steady, as if counting down the seconds until light would finally touch the truth. Once, Ash was Lot 47, a number inked onto a plastic tag hanging from the cage bars at a rural auction for expired things. No one looked at him twice. No one asked what he had been, who he had served, or what he did to earn the label too late. But now he stood at the center of a federal investigation set to open. He was the reason a journalist had gambled her career on a man who didn't exist in any civilian registry. The reason a soldier who had kept silent for years now stood and spoke, not out of vengeance, but for justice, for a dog who had never stopped waiting. At the newsroom back in state, when Claire submitted the story, the headline avoided buzzwords. She didn't reach for war crimes or military secrets. She wrote, "A dog survived, and a memory that won't be erased." Beneath the headline was a photo of Ash, not standing tall, not leaping, but sitting on a mist-covered lawn, neck still bearing the faint imprint where a numbered collar once lay. He didn't testify. He had no fingerprints. He couldn't argue or plead. But in his eyes was a story deep enough to make anyone stop, because the very existence of Ash raised a question no system could answer. If everything they said was true, why did the dog they thought was dead come back? 6 a.m.? At the second line, a small independent newsroom known mostly for local exposés and Saturday afternoon essays, something stirred. A quiet fuse had been lit. Claire Rhodes stood in front of her monitor, the cursor blinking like a pulse waiting for its final push. The headline was done. The image was chosen. Every fact had been triple-checked, cross-verified, and archived to the most rigid standards. But there was one thing she couldn't fact-check: her own trembling hands, hovering over the mouse as if they knew this wasn't just a story. It was a quiet detonation about to ripple through the desks of people who had long believed this kind of thing couldn't happen. Beneath the headline, "The Forgotten Dog and the Mission They Tried to Erase," was the opening line. Once known as Lot 47 in a military dog auction, Ash, real name Bravo, was never just a discarded animal. He was part of a special unit deployed under a shadow operation called Project Sentry, a program training dogs as tools for off-the-record infiltration missions. His memory, though unwritten, holds the untold crimes of a system never meant to be seen. Claire clicked publish. No calls, no approval chain, just a single keystroke. And the article surged to the front page, instantly pushed to the website, mobile app, and newsletter feeds. Within 10 minutes, the first comment appeared. Is this a dog or a witness? Within an hour, the servers jammed. Traffic exceeded 500,000 hits, the highest in the publication's history. By hour 3, the hashtags were everywhere. #, Justice for Bravo, #, Project, Sen tries real #, bring them home. More than 20 regional stations reached out, requesting interviews with Claire. Her inbox flooded. Messages from global journalists, animal rights organizations, and veterans who had once fought in the same zones. But among the hundreds of subject lines, one message made Claire jolt upright. Anonymous account. I served in Sentry. I know what they did to Bravo 03. Call me. And in that moment, Claire understood. This story didn't end in a byline. It had just become the first shot of a nationwide investigation. Within 24 hours, a whisper had turned into a storm. From small-town streets in Nebraska to decommissioned military bases dotting the East Coast, the story of a dog named Ash, a silent survivor, was igniting fires across community boards, military forums, and watchdog circles. No one debated if the story was true anymore. They asked, why has no one told it until now? On the National Veterans Forum, the repost from the second line received over 100,000 comments in 2 days. One logistics officer wrote, I once saw a K9 get its chip removed and taken away. I didn't understand back then. Now I do. The Armed Protection for Animal Welfare, APW, a group rarely in headlines, called a press conference. Spokeswoman Jolene Thatch stated, "If this article is accurate, then this isn't about a dog. This is about a war crime, where service animals, creatures who bled for us, were treated like disposable hardware." The article triggered outrage in independent defense watchdog communities. Within 72 hours, over 60,000 signatures were collected, demanding a House inquiry into off-record military operations conducted under private contracts. Pressure mounted. The White House issued a statement, "We are reviewing the allegations raised by investigative reporter Claire Rhodes. The President has directed the Homeland Security Advisory Team to coordinate with the Pentagon and assess the credibility of the claims." Simultaneously, major media outlets, CNN, BBC, and others, translated the story and expanded coverage. The photo of Ash lying beside Cade Mercer outside a weathered cabin in Grayson Bay became front-page material. That image became a symbol, not of a PR campaign, not of a scandal, but of one haunting question. What have we done to those who once saved us? From a number, Lot 47, Ash had become something more. A living witness forcing an entire system to reckon with the memory it tried so hard to erase. The Capitol dome gleamed faintly under the gray veil of a Washington, D.C. autumn, but inside the closed-door hearing room of the Congressional Oversight Committee, no warmth could be found. Everything was sterile. Fluorescent lights, paper-strewn desks, crisp suits of aides, and the granite-set expressions of elected officials. Rowan Beck, white shirt sleeves rolled, sat upright at the far right of the testimony table. Beside him sat Cade Mercer, a man once listed among the dead. And beneath them, on the cold marble floor, lay Ash, still and unmoving, a breath of silence in a universe full of noise. No one called him Lot 47 anymore. No one referred to him as biological evidence. He was officially entered into the hearing record as Bravo, former K-9 unit, Project Sentry, represented by Cade Mercer. Across the room sat 11 committee members, drawn from Homeland Security, Military Affairs, and Governmental Ethics. Recording devices hummed. Cameras stood like statues, and on the rear screen, pulled line by line, were excerpts from Claire Rhodes' explosive report. Chairman West tapped the gavel. This hearing is convened to clarify the role of unofficial units in extraterritorial military operations, and more specifically, to address the allegations of combat dogs used in potential violations of war ethics. Mr. Rowan Beck, please begin. Rowan stood. His voice didn't echo, but it held like steel buried in battlefield mud. "I don't represent any institution. I'm just a man who walked into a dog auction, saw a forgotten animal, and brought him home." He paused, glancing down at Ash, still resting with his head across Cade's boot. "But when I saw those eyes, I knew. I didn't bring home a dog. I brought home a memory someone had tried to bury." One committee member frowned. "Did you know at the time he was a soldier?" Rowan shook his head. Number, I only knew he had once believed in someone so much that he waited the rest of his life just to see them again. Cade rose, his voice calm, and the story began again. A mission betrayed. The earliest signs of a unit wipe plan, Bravo pulling him out of hell, then disappearing into chaos. Recorders kept spinning, but no senator scribbled another note. They watched, listened, and in the figures before them, they no longer saw witnesses, but survivors, and a creature who had never let go. The air inside the chamber thickened, like a meeting between men who'd bled in sand and those who'd never left marble hallways. Among typed testimonies and sharp congressional stares, what lingered wasn't on paper. It lived in how Rowan described each scar, how Cade slowed when he named old unit members, and in how neither man's eyes left Ash, like they were recounting a tale they still hadn't escaped. No one called them informants. No one asked for statements. There were no counter versions, because what they offered wasn't data. It was residue, wrinkles earned by waiting, shaking tones when naming a road someone never returned from, a wound centered in the chest, uncurable, unspoken, called simply survival. Cade didn't give a speech. He asked, "We're not here to accuse, we just want to ask, why are the lives that saved others not worth protecting?" Rowan followed without cue. "We survived, but at the cost of silence, of loss, of nights that never seemed to end. And if Bravo, Ash, hadn't been found, then neither of us would have anything left worth telling. Sometimes words don't carry as far as presence." The way Cade stepped to the bench without blinking. The way Rowan clasped his shoulder, not as comfort, but confirmation. "I'm here. You're not alone." And Ash, silent, unmoving, just lay there, breath steady, head resting on the foot of the man he once followed into fire. Under the harsh congressional lights, they were no longer case files. They were proof that what is right can still survive, even after the world burns it to ash. In the chamber's hushed quiet, where every page turn or pen click sounded like thunder, Ash didn't move. No one cued him. No one called his name. No one referred to him as a subject in record. But all eyes turned to him, as if the moment he lifted his head, the room itself would fall silent in reverence. His thick coat had grayed, especially at the collar and bridge of his nose. One ear, torn years ago, drooped slightly. His legs, once agile across sand and landmine routes, now tucked beneath him, but retained the posture of a soldier at rest, not surrender. And his eyes, deep amber like cooled magma, scanned the room with the gaze of one trained in battlefield assessment. No fear, no defiance, no fatigue. Only the calm of one who had seen far more than the world believed any dog could comprehend. When Cade sat and instinctively placed a hand on Ash's head, the dog leaned slightly into it, like a soldier acknowledging that the wait was over. No bark needed, no blood required, no need to recount every life saved, every bomb dodged, every bullet survived. Because the silence Ash held amid the clamor of hearings, flags, and skeptical eyes was the last truth left unshaken. He no longer runs, no longer guards through the night, no longer jumps into roaring trucks, but in the stillness of his body, resolute, present, alert, one message rang louder than any testimony. War takes many things, but it did not take the loyalty of a soul still here. The last winter passed, leaving a thin veil of mist over the southern Oregon hills, and it was there, where cell towers vanished and maps turned vague, that the Sentry Haven began to appear. Not like something newly built, but as if it had always existed and was simply waiting to be found. The old wooden cabin that once belonged to Rowan's family, once nothing more than a fireplace filled with ash, a few half-drunk bottles, and a gravel road trailing down to the stream, was now transformed into a sanctuary, a training field, a line of humble sleeping quarters, and a small veterinary clinic built from repurposed containers. At the front gate, carved into a slab of oak, stood a simple inscription: "The Sentry Haven." A place where no one stands watch alone. No one asked who named it, no discussions were held, because there was only one name that carried both recognition and forgiveness for everything that had come before. Sentry. Not to recall a disavowed operation, but to affirm one truth, that they were still here, the ones who had once held the line between life and death, between truth and oblivion. Cade rebuilt the old watchpost along the forest edge, the same pine shelter where he had spent 3 weeks after leaving Grayson Bay. Rowan converted the storage shed into a common room, where people could make coffee, fix old tools, or simply sit in silence. No flags were raised, no banners hung. the Sentry Haven held no grand opening. A few old friends came by, most of them veterans who had once known Cade or heard whispers of Bravo in nameless, scattered stories. Some arrived with worn backpacks, others brought dogs, thin, limping, scarred. Rowan gave no speech. Cade stood, but didn't address the group. Yet that evening, as the sun dipped behind the freshly painted fence, the two men stood side by side, gazing over the field stretching before the porch. And there, among patches of uneven grass, Ash lay beside a newly arrived yellow lab. No titles, no roles, no need for certificates. He was simply there, a living symbol that as long as eyes still watched over each other, no one was ever truly left behind. One morning, before the dew had cleared from the window glass, a veteran named Wallace arrived with an unnamed Malinois. He said only one thing: he still dreams when he sleeps. Days later, a widow from Montana drove 800 miles with a half-blind shepherd. Then came a 10-year-old boy with PTSD from a traffic accident, quiet, reserved, his grip locked around the leash of a dog that had survived an illegal breeding compound. And so, step by step, the Sentry Haven became a place not for those seeking therapy, but for those who had long learned to tighten their armor and bury their wounds, and who now, for the first time, were learning how to let go without shame. Here, no one asked, "Where did you serve?" They asked, "Was the dream rough last night?" No one said, "He's a rescue dog." They asked, "Did he sleep okay?" And each day, as the grass grew and the wind moved through the trees, as footsteps crunched over gravel paths and breaths aligned between human and canine, something began to mend. A soldier no longer had to prove his worth standing among old comrades. A dog didn't need to perform tricks to earn its place. A child didn't have to behave to be welcomed. All that mattered was presence, in a space where the past was honored, pain was understood without judgment, and what was once dismissed as excess equipment was now held with reverence, like the soul fragments of a life once shattered. One night, Rowan passed the rear yard and saw a dog resting its head on a veteran's lap. Both had their eyes closed, not out of exhaustion, but because, finally, they had found a place safe enough to sleep. And in the flickering light of the oil lamp by the gate, the words, "The Sentry Haven," seemed etched not in wood, but in the very breath of those who once believed they'd wander forever. A place for those who once stood guard, and who are now watched over by understanding. By mid-March, the mountain winds had begun to warm after weeks of frost. The eucalyptus tree behind the main house was budding, and Ash, his pace slower now, his head held lower, still moved with steady rhythm through the grounds. He no longer ran as he once did, but with each step, it felt as though the entire haven found its breath again, falling back into the cadence of something quietly held together. That afternoon, a veteran named Joel Arrington arrived at the center just before dusk. He'd been transferred from a psychological rehab facility for soldiers recovering from trauma. His face had dulled under years of medication and self-isolation behind doors that no longer needed locks. No luggage, no introduction. Only a pair of eyes scanning every surface like a man searching for a place to vanish. Joel was placed in room 4, the last room along the main lodge, with a window looking out over the open field where dogs were usually released in the early morning. For the first 3 days, he didn't step off the porch. He didn't enter the community hall. Meals were left on a chair by his door and picked up with no trace of whether anything had been eaten. On the 4th day, while Rowan and Cade were reviewing the week's schedule, Ash, without a word, without a signal, rose from his usual place by the fireplace and walked down the hall. No one called him, no leash, no command. He moved as if summoned by a voice too quiet for human ears. Ash stopped at room 4 and lay down. He didn't pant, didn't bark. He simply rested his head on the worn rug outside the door. Half an hour later, the door creaked open. Joel stood there, unshaven, his hand trembling. But for the first time in years, his gaze stopped on something not out of fear or defense. He looked at Ash. And Ash looked back. No words, no gestures, just the eyes of a soul who had crossed battlefields telling another, "I'm here. Whenever you're ready, I'll still be here." From that day forward, Ash lay outside Joel's door each morning for exactly 30 minutes. On the 7th morning, Joel stepped out holding a cup of coffee, his first one poured by his own hand. He sat beside Ash on the porch step. No applause, no record. But from the kitchen window, Rowan saw it and knew a door had just opened, silently. At Sentry Haven, no one was asked to share. No one was forced into scheduled participation. No one questioned why someone showed up late or spent an entire afternoon sitting quietly, staring across the field. Because here, presence itself was a kind of language. And Ash, no longer the strong, fleet-footed dog of wartime, no longer the star of any therapy brochure or press photo, was perhaps the only soul in the sanctuary who truly understood that language to its core. Joel sat beside Ash day after day. No conversation, no touch, but always there at the same time, as though both man and dog understood something beyond words in the way neither rushed to leave. On the 14th morning, Rowan was repairing a pipe behind the kitchen when he noticed something subtle. Instead of heading straight for the field, Ash paused beside the wooden bench where Joel usually sat. He rested his head on it, but this time his face turned back toward the house. Like a silent message. That evening, Joel arrived earlier than usual. He no longer carried coffee, but a worn mechanic's rag. He placed it next to Ash, then sat down and took out an old army lighter, rusted and unused. He turned it over in his hands without sparking it. And Ash, no head lift, no tail wag, simply lay there, breathing slow and deep, as if absorbing the man's uncertainty without trying to fix it. They needed no dialogue. There was no documentation. No counselor stood nearby. But that night, after the hallway lights dimmed one by one, Joel remained. His hand touched Ash's back, not trembling, not tentative. No flinch, no shield, just one simple gesture, as though someone had finally found the thing he had long been unable to name. And Ash, as always, didn't respond with movement. He didn't lick the hand. He didn't look up, because his presence alone was already the answer. When little Noah came to Sentry Haven, the file said only a few things. 8 years old, lost his mother in a car accident on the way home from piano practice. His father, a hearing-impaired combat veteran with anxiety disorder, lived in a support center over 100 miles away. Since the night of the accident, Noah had not spoken a word. No screams, no tears, not even a whisper. Only a searching gaze, as if scanning every face in a crowd for someone he couldn't quite name. He was placed at Haven temporarily, part of a pilot program linking orphaned children with therapeutic dogs. No expectations, no pressure, just the hope that no new scars would be added. On the first day, Noah hid behind his guardian, gripping the back of their jacket like it was his last anchor. On the second, he sat by the window in the communal hall, doodling silently, showing no response when greeted. On the third, when Ash walked across the courtyard and paused in front of the boy, for reasons unknown, everything shifted. Ash didn't approach, didn't entice. He simply stopped a few meters away and turned his head, as if waiting. Noah saw him. He didn't run over, didn't recoil, but for the first time in forever, his feet moved forward on their own. Ash led Noah around the field like it was something they'd done 100 times before. Every afternoon, around the same soft hour when sunlight slipped through the trees, they'd meet again. Noah still didn't speak, but he followed, sat beside Ash, reached out and touched his back with fingers so gentle it felt like he feared reopening an old wound. On the 17th afternoon, the wind was colder than usual. Rowan was checking the irrigation valves when he heard the soft patter of small shoes on dry earth. He turned and saw Noah standing in the middle of the field, hand resting on Ash's head, who was half asleep in the last glow of sun. The boy leaned down, close to the old dog's ear, and whispered softly, as if to himself, "Home." No cameras, no therapists, only Ash, still as always, tilted his head slightly toward the boy's hand and closed his eyes. No need for more words, no explanation. Just one long, quiet moment, enough to know that here, among those once broken and those still learning how to stand again, someone had finally found the way back. April mornings began with the wind slipping through the old pines along the edge of the center. Rowan rose early, as he always did, brewed coffee, made the first rounds. Ash no longer joined him every morning. These days, he slept more, moved slower, but he still waited in the middle courtyard every afternoon, like clockwork. On his way back in, Rowan stopped by the small mailbox hanging on the gatepost. Inside was an envelope. No return address, no postal stamp. Just a single line printed cleanly. To the one who didn't look away. Inside was a handwritten letter, penned in sharp, deliberate strokes, the kind of handwriting shaped by years of quick decisions made in darkness. The paper carried the scent of old smoke and damp, like it had passed through places that don't exist on maps. Rowan read it slowly. No change in expression, no rush. Only a pause, subtle but firm, when he reached the middle. That's where the tone shifted, from matter-of-fact to something close to trembling. I was part of it. My name doesn't matter. If you're reading this, it means I've watched long enough to know. You didn't just save a dog. You did something an entire system couldn't. You faced the consequences of orders no one thought they'd have to answer for. There was no apology, no justification, only acknowledgement from the other side. From the side that once buried numbers like Lot 47 in surplus manifests, that once signed off erasures in red ink, convinced no one would ever dig them up again. The letter continued. There are things I helped cover up, reports I edited, and eyes that looked at me through one-way glass like I was already a ghost. But when I saw Bravo's face, when I saw those eyes on the front page, I knew. The truth survives. It can't stay buried forever. Rowan held the letter for a long while, then folded it and slipped it into his jacket pocket. He didn't mention it to Cade. Didn't contact any journalists, didn't reply. But the next morning he went to the wood shop behind the camp, pulled out a long pine plank, and began carving. Letter by letter with a hand tool blade. Truth doesn't need to win. It only needs to be remembered. The letter wasn't about gratitude. Toward the end, the handwriting turned shaky, either from a trembling hand or a shaken conscience. The tone no longer confessed. It warned. Bravo isn't the only one. Men like Cade aren't the only ones who stayed behind. Project Sentry, the name you and that reporter pulled into the light, that's just one layer. Beneath it lie systems no longer charted, no longer recorded, and inside them live still being used for things no government has ever voted on. Rowan frowned. The next lines were almost illegible, trails of ink veering off, words heavier, harder to follow. One of them, I saw it return. One eye blind, a broken leg, no chip, no name, but it came back, found its way across the border, back to the old camp. When I filed the report, they said, "No records. Cancel it." And that was the end. No coordinates, no photographs. But in the smudged folds of that page, something was undeniable. Ash was not the only story pulled from the dark. Rowan reread the final lines 3 times, then tucked the letter into his old field notebook, the one where he had once sketched the first blueprint for the gate. He didn't tell anyone. But the next morning, when Claire Rhodes came by for tea, Rowan handed her a cup, then quietly slid a single piece of paper across the table. On it, written in steady, resolute ink, "If there's another name, another scar, another untold story, we'll be the ones to record it." Claire nodded. No questions. Ash, lying on the porch in the warm hush of morning, eyes half closed but ears tilted just slightly toward them, as if listening, not with sound, but with a memory that had never truly faded. It rained for 3 days straight, not a storm, not even strong wind, just a gentle, unhurried rhythm of droplets on tin roofs, like time itself was sighing in long, even breaths. Summer arrived late in Haven, and the wind still carried the scent of decayed leaves and old ash, as if the season hadn't yet decided to let go of the one before. Rowan sat in his workroom, a small cabin nestled between the 2 housing wings of the center, where he usually fixed tools, logged treatment records, and tracked training progress. But today, the ledgers remained untouched. In front of him lay an old leather notebook, the kind he used to keep in his pack when stationed at the border as a mechanical specialist, filled with bunker layouts, supply trails, and notes on breakdowns the radios couldn't transmit. Today, he opened a blank page and wrote, "Date. I'm not sure anymore. Might be Friday, might not. Ash is lying on the porch like always. But these days it takes him longer to get up, and every step, just slightly, his left hip trembles, like something inside is giving way, piece by piece. But he never whimpers, never sighs. He just turns to look at me each morning, as if checking whether I'm still okay." Rowan paused, glanced out the window. Outside, Ash was curled beneath the overhang, head resting on the mat, eyes half closed, but his ears still tilted toward this room, like every day. Rowan looked down, continued writing. "I used to think I rescued Ash. That day at the auction, when I raised my hand, I believed I was doing the right thing, pulling a desperate creature out of a place where no one wanted him. But now, that wasn't it. I didn't save him. He saved me. Every single day." The final line was written with the clearest stroke. No embellishments, no extended reasoning, just words etched into the wood grain of memory Rowan had carried for years, once hollowed by shrapnel, gunpowder, and questions no one dared answer. The room stayed still, but something in the air shifted. Like those words, once written, had quietly opened a door, even if no one had walked through it yet. By mid-June, Ash's slowing was undeniable. No one spoke of it. No one showed worry. At Sentry Haven, they understood the quiet law of time. Things we love do not need announcements, and old souls fade like forests into mist, quietly, without tragedy. Ash still came out each morning, but he no longer ran. His walks were now only a few paces around the fence before lying by the lavender bush at the end of the path, where sunlight fell just warm enough, never harsh. His body thinned by the week, his left hip wasted, gray fur coated his jaw, yet his eyes, those eyes, remained as clear as they were the day he stood on the deck during the campaign years ago. Still lit up whenever he heard Rowan's footsteps, still tracked every newcomer, every recovering veteran, as if checking who might need a silent presence at their side. One afternoon, he lay beneath Joel, the soldier who hadn't spoken for a year after arriving, and let the man's hand run gently down his spine. No flinch, no tension, just a long exhale, eyes closing softly as if saying, "It's your watch now." Rowan watched the changes from a distance. He didn't interfere, didn't shift Ash's routines. He simply added an extra blanket by the porch each night, warmed water for Ash's breakfast, and placed a bowl of soft-cooked rice beside him, even though Ash rarely ate anymore. Each morning, Ash waited at the steps, like always. Each afternoon, he still lifted his head when Claire, Cade, or anyone passed by. And every night, as Rowan sat alone in the yard with his notebook, Ash lay beside him, close enough that his breath brushed lightly against Rowan's ankle. He didn't rise quickly anymore, didn't walk far, but he hadn't left. As if he were waiting for something yet to happen, for someone yet to return, or for the moment when no one would need to say, "It's okay now. You can rest." That day, the sky turned amber unusually early. The sun wasn't harsh. It didn't blaze. It was just a soft, golden light, like a gentle hand brushing across shoulders that had once braced against war and memory. The wind blew inland from the sea, threading through the pine trees with the scent of salt, damp grass, and the kind of ending you couldn't name. But somehow, everyone recognized. Ash lay on the porch of the main cabin, his head resting on a thin blanket Rowan had swapped out the night before. That blanket once wrapped around an abandoned Malinois, suffering from nerve damage. It had seen the first winter back when Sentry Haven was still just dirt and plywood, and the kitchen hadn't even been built. Ash wasn't sleeping, he wasn't dreaming, he was watching. Straight toward the gate. Cade passed by, a broken lantern in hand. He meant to stop and scratch Ash's back like always, but when he saw that gaze, not focused on him, but fixed beyond the dust-lit courtyard, he stopped. Didn't speak, didn't intrude. From the kitchen doorway, Rowan saw it all. He set his mug down, walked out, and quietly sat beside the old shepherd. Ash didn't turn his head. He kept watching the gate, as if a familiar figure were standing there. Still. Waiting. Not yet stepping forward. The wind nudged the gate just enough to make it click against the latch, a sound no different from any other day, and yet today it rang out like the last signal of a completed watch. Rowan gently ran his hand down Ash's back, pausing over the old scar still visible beneath the whitening fur. He said nothing, but in his eyes, there wasn't just farewell, there was acknowledgement. "You've stood watch long enough." Ash didn't close his eyes right away. He kept looking, clear, steady, not out of instinct or duty, but as if making sure that the last person had finally made peace with their ghosts. Only when the sunlight touched the back fence and the sounds of children playing behind the retreat's cabins echoed like the final notes of a shift did Ash lower his head onto the blanket. Slowly, gently, like an exhale that no longer carried burden. 3 days later, the first summer rain arrived. Not heavy, but enough to soften the ground and drum against the overhang in a rhythm like some ancient ritual no one ever spoke of, but someone had once promised to keep sacred. Ash was placed in a simple wooden box Rowan built by hand. No paint, no polish, just bare pine, as honest and unadorned as the life of the dog it carried. No one gathered in rows, no speeches, no songs, just a narrow path leading to the edge of the woods, where Ash once watched children learning to run again, where Joel once wrote his first sentence after years of silence, where a boy named Noah once whispered the words, "Come home," and the entire sanctuary had quietly held on to it as a symbol ever since. Cade walked on the left, Rowan on the right. Between them, the box, covered in dry leaves and a strip of worn fabric from an old military uniform, the same one Cade had been wearing the day Bravo pulled him out of a desert of blood and heat. And at the final stop, a single stone marker. Bravo, Ash, the gatekeeper of memory. Not long after, above the fireplace in the center's main room, where people gathered to talk, sip coffee, or sit in shared silence, a new photograph was framed. It wasn't dramatic. No uniforms, no staged heroics, just a candid moment caught near the end of autumn. Cade stands on the left, hand on Rowan's shoulder. Rowan stands in the middle, palm resting lightly on Ash's head. And Ash, head nestled over both their boots, eyes gently closed, as if finally understanding he no longer needed to stand guard. Beneath the frame, carved into a deep brown pinewood plaque. He wasn't just rescued, he rescued us all. Newcomers often paused before the picture. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need the full story, because the eyes in that photo, and the breath still lingering in the grains of wood, had already told enough. Some stories don't need a climax, or a miracle. Just a gaze, like Ash's that first day at the auction, enough to link two broken lives back together. Ash, or Bravo, was never just a dog who got saved. He was the bridge, between memory and the now, between truths once buried and faith slowly rebuilding, step by step. Through his quiet presence, he reminded everyone. Loyalty doesn't need to be taught. Healing doesn't need lectures. And love, even silent, can reshape the world. German Shepherds are more than symbols of strength and intellect. Beneath those strong shoulders lies a heart that senses sorrow, guards the weak, and waits until someone returns, or until a final duty is fulfilled. If you've read this far, please remember, somewhere out there, in a rescue kennel on the edge of town, in the eyes of a dog sitting beneath a rainy porch, or maybe deep inside your own heart, there are lives waiting for a chance to be trusted, to be loved, to live out the purest part of their nature, to be someone's forever companion. And if you can do just one thing, drop by a shelter, leave a clean bowl of water, or offer a single gentle touch, please do. Because in a world flooded with noise, sometimes the gentlest act is the loudest call for hope. A boy vanished into the forest in the middle of a storm. No one knew if he was still alive, or already part of the wilderness forever. But then Bramble, the German shepherd once written off as useless, returned, soaked and silent, with the boy's drenched jacket clutched between his jaws. Out of thousands of acres of unmarked woodland, how did Bramble know exactly where the boy had fallen? The afternoon light in Oak Ridge fell soft and pale. Slanted rays slipped through the oak canopy, scattering golden patterns across the gravel path, leading to a modest rescue center on the outskirts of town. From behind the main building came a broken chorus of barking, the scrape of claws on metal, and the sharp panting of souls still waiting for a way out. But in the middle of all that noise, the man stepping down from a dusty gray pickup showed no sign of hurry. He locked the driver's side door with a practiced flick of his hand, then stood still for a moment, eyes fixed on the edge of the awning where a red, white, and blue flag fluttered gently in the autumn breeze. Callan Ross wore a thick brown button-down with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing sun-worn skin and the faded tattoo of a Marine unit curling along his left forearm. His boots were dust-caked, his face unremarkable except for his eyes, dark and hollowed, the kind of look found in people who've walked through war and chosen silence over storytelling. But he wasn't here to talk. He'd come for a dog. Behind the desk, Lynn adjusted her bifocals and squinted down at the appointment log, eyebrows inching upward. "Callan Ross? You're the one who called yesterday?" Callan nodded. "I want the dog listed as the toughest case. ID number SH09. She didn't hide her surprise. Her eyes narrowed as she looked him over. "Bramble? You're sure?" "Completely." The kennels at the far end of the compound weren't part of the usual tour. The air back there was heavier, a blend of disinfectant, rust, and unbrushed fur. Lynn walked ahead, jangling a keyring and flipping through an old manila file. He came down from a training facility up north. Still got the old military chip. Was property of the armed forces once. Got dropped from active use, no explanation. Won't eat if someone's watching. Doesn't let anyone touch his neck, especially the left side. A trainee got bit trying to undo his lead. Kalen gave no reaction. He walked behind her, slow and steady, eyes scanning the rows of cages. Every dog had a story. Some rushed the bars, barking like mad, pawing at the mesh like they were begging to be noticed. Others curled in corners, shrinking from the world. But the last kennel on the right, where Lynn stopped, was perfectly still. The dog inside was sitting. Not lying down, not pacing, not turning away, just sitting, upright, eyes locked on Callan, a jet-black German shepherd with a burnt gold chest, tufts of thick fur along its shoulders, ears high, eyes deep brown. No fear, just stillness. The kind of stillness that came from pride, or maybe resignation too heavy for noise. Nothing in its face gave anything away, but something in its gaze made Callan stop longer than he meant to. "That's Bramble," Lynn murmured. "He's been here 6 months. Nobody's picked him." Callan stepped closer to the bars. Bramble didn't flinch. He crouched down, bringing himself level with the dog's gaze. For a few drawn-out seconds, there was nothing but silence. Then Callan slowly extended his hand, not too close to the bars, palm open in mid-air. Bramble didn't move, didn't growl, just stared at the hand, as if weighing something deeper than instinct. Then the dog turned his head, not away, but slightly sideways, revealing the faint scar running along the left side of his face, catching a sliver of late-day light. Callan exhaled softly, the sound barely more than a shift in the wind. "I want him," he said to Lynn, eyes still locked with Bramble's. "We don't usually recommend—" She hesitated. "He's not good with homes, not friendly. He's got a history." "I live alone," Callan cut in. "No family, no kids. I've got land. I've got time. I want him." The adoption process took longer than usual. Lynn called a supervisor to confirm. Another staffer fetched a specialized harness and safety lead. They signed a separate waiver, the kind reserved for animals marked behaviorally unpredictable. Bramble was led out of the kennel on a double collar. He didn't pull, didn't bark, didn't resist. But when they neared Callan's truck, he suddenly halted. The breeze stirred through the trees, lifting the fur along his shoulders like a tide rising beneath his skin. Callan opened the truck's back door. Inside were a soft blanket, a steel water bowl, and a space wide enough for the dog to stretch without feeling caged. Bramble looked in, then climbed up without a sound. "That's weird," one of the staff murmured behind them. "He's never gotten into anyone's car before." Callan shut the door gently. "Maybe it's not about who chooses the dog. Maybe it's about who's quiet enough to listen." Lynn handed over the final folder. "Good luck, Mr. Ross. Sincerely." Callan didn't answer. He got behind the wheel and started the engine. In the rearview mirror, Bramble sat motionless, eyes facing out the back, unbothered by the hum of the road. The drive from the shelter to Callan's cabin wasn't long, but the terrain was rough. Towering gray-green pines lined the way, arching overhead to form a tunnel of branches and shadows. Autumn sunlight flickered through the leaves, scattering shifting gold across the windshield like memories brushing past. Callan glanced once at the mirror. Bramble still hadn't moved. No whimpering, no barking, no trace of resentment. Only those brown eyes, staring into something far beyond even the glass behind them, farther than anything Callan could see. Around its neck, beneath the thick fur, hung a metal tag glinting faintly in the dim light. A faint scratch traced the outline of 2 engraved initials, DH. Beneath that, a line of numbers, not a rescue code, Not a registration, a military unit ID. Kalen recognized the type. He had worn a tag just like it through 3 deployments in Kandahar, and he had once removed his own to slip it gently into the pocket of his closest friend in those final moments when breath still lingered and dust from the nearby blast hadn't yet settled into silence. The wind slipped in again through the cracked window, carrying with it the scent of pine, the dampness of earth, and that particular stillness only a silent afternoon can carry. An afternoon that hadn't yet found the words to speak. And in that moment, Callan felt his hand, resting loosely on the gear stick, grow slightly cold, as if time itself had brushed past, slipping silently through a hidden fissure between 2 worlds. And in that same moment, Bramble turned his head. Not toward Callan, but in the opposite direction, toward the forest, toward the place where the sunlight was slowly vanishing beyond the treetops, like a door opening only when no one was watching. Callan's cabin stood alone, removed from the town, tucked into the dense circle of aging trees where fallen leaves layered thick around the backyard, and the wind, pushing through the porch railings, sounded like the breath of someone who had lived too long in solitude. There was no television noise, no framed photos of family, no scent of cooked meals, no laughter spilling from the kitchen into the living room, only the scent of aged wood and the faint lines in the ceiling that Callan hadn't gotten around to fixing since the last winter passed. When he opened the car door, Bramble didn't step out immediately. Callan didn't call to him. He simply left the door open, ascended the front steps quietly, unlatched the cabin door, and left the empty space behind him to wait. Not with insistence, but with patience. It took more than 2 minutes for Bramble to jump down. The soft sound of claws on the dirt road was the only sign. He didn't sniff, didn't circle, didn't pause to mark or search for exits. He just walked inside. The way a shadow moves when it's looking for the place it once belonged. The stainless steel water bowl sat in the kitchen corner, untouched beside the dry food that still held its form. Bramble approached, lowered his head, then remained still. His eyes fixed not on the bowl, but on the peeling wood-paneled wall ahead, as though something beyond it was calling, not in sound, but in presence. Callan pulled out an old chair and placed it near the window, where the last light of day still filtered through the dusty mesh of the curtain. He didn't try to engage, didn't give orders, didn't ask questions. He simply sat there, watching the tangled, wild garden in the back, where an old rusted swing still rocked gently whenever the wind made its way through. After a while, Bramble lay down, not in the relaxed sprawl of comfort, but in the guarded stance of a soldier at rest. Front legs crossed, head held steady, eyes locked on the dim space between the kitchen and the basement door, the one Callan rarely went near. The ticking of the wall clock became the only sound that dared divide time in that cabin. Every small noise, the creak of wind, the thud of a branch, the soft shifting of the wooden floor, caused Bramble's ears to flick, but he did not bark. Not once, not for the entirety of that first night. As dusk deepened into darkness, Callan laid an old blanket near the hearth. Not as an invitation, but as a gesture, like making space for something unnamed but not unwelcome. Bramble glanced at it just once, then returned his gaze to the darkened kitchen, as if listening to a command that only he could hear. Callan stood, opened the back door. Night air swept in, brushing the edge of his shirt sleeve against his wrist with its chill. "Up to you," he murmured, stepping outside and lighting a cigarette, the glow of its tip flaring briefly like a signal fire in the quiet. Bramble didn't follow, didn't look, didn't move. When Callan returned, the blanket showed no sign of use. The night stretched slowly. No growling, no scratching at doors, only the wind against the cabin walls and the faint shuffle of Bramble adjusting his position, whenever the clock announced another hour gone. By morning, as Callan woke, the scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the kitchen air. He poured himself a cup, lifted it toward his lips, and paused. On the floor, just beneath the old wooden table, were faint paw prints in the thin dust. Not many, just a quiet path, from the kitchen to the front door, then back again. A soft arc around the hearth. The blanket remained untouched, but on it a single black hair lay curled, a fine crescent shape, as if something had stood there a while, then left before the light could catch it. Callan sat down, resting his hand on his knee, eyes drifting to where Bramble lay. Same corner, same distance. Just enough to be present. Just enough not to vanish. Morning light slipped through the window slats, falling across Bramble's back in a quiet warmth. His black coat shimmered faintly. Not enough to reflect anything clearly, but enough to make it hard to look away. Callan watched for a long time, then lifted his old ceramic mug, stepped to the sink, and refilled it. Slowly, carefully, as though any sudden sound might scatter what had only just begun to settle in the air. Bramble didn't change posture. Bramble didn't sleep. The ears stayed lifted, barely tilted as if awaiting a command that never came, even though the only sounds in the cabin were the rustle of wind brushing against the tin roof and the gentle creak of wooden boards beneath Callan's steps. That afternoon, as Callan decided to sweep out the back shed, the place where he stored his old tools and sealed military gear, Bramble rose. Quietly. Without a bark, without following, simply stood still and watched, eyes tracking every movement with a focus that seemed to stir some echo within its quiet, unreachable memory. When Callan returned, holding a worn blanket to lay in front of the fireplace, his gaze drifted, just for a second, across Bramble's neck. There was something there, not a reflection from the standard issue rescue collar, but something deeper, buried closer to the skin, where the fur looked denser than it should have been. Setting the blanket down, Callan crouched beside Bramble without a sound, slowly closing the space between them inch by inch, not rushing, not startling. Bramble didn't retreat. Callan lifted his hand, not to touch the neck directly, but to gently slide his fingers behind the ruff, combing through the fur with patient strokes, steady and deliberate. And then he felt it, a thin, cold ring of metal, worn and old, not fastened in place but pressed close against the skin, so deeply embedded by time that the fur had nearly swallowed it whole. Callan turned it gently, and a soft click echoed in the stillness, a sound only those who'd served would recognize. The faint metallic whisper of an old military dog chain, heavy with the weight of what was once spoken in silence. A tag slipped from the hidden layer of fur, an oval of scratched metal, dull and weathered, suspended on a fine wire loop. One side showed a faint serial, 457-29-003. On the back, though partially rubbed away, the name was still legible. D. Hale. Callan's breath slowed. Damon Hale. A name he had never heard. And yet, the moment it passed through his mind, something constricted in his chest, not from fear, but from instinct. The kind of knowing built from years of looking commanders in the eye and learning to distinguish between truth and manipulation. It was a name that carried history, not Callan's, but Bramble's. A name that belonged to the dog now sitting before him, unmoving, giving the smallest nod, as if to say, "Yes, I remember." Callan turned the tag over in his palm. The metal was colder than expected. Not just the chill of a lifeless object, but the deeper cold of something that had soaked in time, memory, and orders no longer spoken aloud. He didn't ask Bramble anything. There was no need. The dog's eyes never left the tag resting in Callan's hand, as though it had waited, patiently, silently, for someone to finally uncover what had been hidden for too long. Callan rose and placed the tag on the wooden table by the window. The light had shifted now, deepening into amber, casting a sharp glow across the engraved letters, making the name Hale catch the light, if only for a flicker. Bramble approached. No bark, no sniff. Bramble simply stood there, head level with the table, staring at the name, then turning away without a sound, stepping toward the window where the wind still whispered through the frame. Callan watched, his hand still open beside the tag, fingers barely touching the surface where the past had just resurfaced. That first night after the tag was revealed, the house felt unchanged. Still quiet, still sparse, filled only with empty spaces where breath passed through untouched. But just after the clock crossed 1 in the morning, Callan heard it. Not loud, not hurried, not the kind of sound made to call attention. Just footsteps, even, measured. Light as the breeze across the floor, tracing a perfect circle, from the kitchen to the living room, down the hall past the map-stained wall, and pausing in front of the basement door. Bramble. Callan didn't turn on the light. He only half opened his eyes in the dark, the moon casting a faint silver through the small window above his bed, enough to illuminate the silhouette moving on patrol, tireless, sleepless, as if in Bramble's mind, nighttime wasn't for resting, but for guarding a boundary no one remembered anymore. 3 nights in a row, Bramble traced those same steps. No deviation. No hesitation. By the 4th night, Callan lay on his side, eyes open, heartbeat slow. The soft rhythm of Bramble's paws had become a kind of background pulse in the cabin. Callan began counting, tracking the route as if following a map unseen. 4 steps to the foot of the stairs, 5 left toward the bookcase, 3 to the wooden door. These movements weren't frantic, weren't anxious. Every step Bramble took had the weight of ceremony. Deliberate, quiet, born from a memory Callan could never touch. And then the dreams began. Not the hazy, formless kind, but vivid images, sharp as daylight, sandstorms swirling beneath a burning sun, the shriek of helicopters overhead, the wide, terrified eyes of a young soldier lying in the blood-wet dirt. Some nights, he was running, rifle bouncing against his ribs, sweat mixing with smoke and voices calling out in chaos. Other nights, there was a steel cage in the middle of a desolate field, and inside it, a German shepherd stared back at him, eyes unblinking, collar still wrapped with a battered, unread tag. In the quiet of morning, Callan sat on the front porch, the steam from his coffee curling gently into the still air, his hands wrapped around the cup, as if to draw from it some warmth that went deeper than the chill of dawn, while just beneath the wooden steps, Bramble lay, not asleep, not alert, but hovering in that liminal space between rest and watchfulness, like a sentry who had taken over a post once held by someone who was no longer there. Each time Callan passed the basement door, something inside his chest would tighten. Not quite fear, not exactly dread, but a subtle contraction, a faint echo of something old and buried beginning to stir, as though a door within the mind, long sealed and silent, had started to open by the smallest of degrees. Too slow to mark, too quiet to name. The tag with Damon Hale's name still sat untouched on the table, unmoved since the day it was placed there. But one afternoon, when sunlight pierced the darker corner of the house in that particular slant only found in late day, Callan saw Bramble seated before the basement door, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on the gap in the wooden frame, listening, as if from beneath the floorboards some faint signal was rising, not in sound, but in sensation. There was no noise, no movement, nothing tangible to chase. Only a moment, briefer than a breath, but with an echo that lingered far longer than the night that followed. One evening, sleep refused to come. Callan made his way to the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and when he turned back toward the living room, he found Bramble standing at the center, eyes locked onto him, the kitchen light casting a faint glow across the dog's wide brow, splitting the space around him into a strange and quiet boundary between shadow and something unnamed. Callan stepped forward, lowered himself slowly onto the wooden floor, his back leaning against the wall. Bramble did not move. The space between them remained, no closer than a deep breath, no farther than a held silence. "What unit were you with?" Callan asked, not expecting an answer, not truly seeking one, but because speaking the question aloud somehow softened the emptiness left behind by dreams that unraveled with the morning light. Bramble tilted his head. A small gesture, barely a nod. But to Callan, it was as if a soldier had acknowledged a command, not from belief, but from the unspoken understanding that sometimes duty is the only thing left when the world falls apart. That night, Callan did not return to his bed. He lay there, right on the rug in the middle of the room, his eyes tracing the hairline cracks that stretched across the wooden ceiling above him like maps of lost days. And as his breath began to slow and the weight of sleep pressed gently in, he felt a slight shift near his feet. Bramble had drawn closer, not fully, not intrusively, but just enough that the warmth of his body grazed against Callan's leg. It wasn't contact in the ordinary sense. It was permission, an allowed presence in the space between two souls who, each in their own way, had long believed they'd never be near anyone again. The next morning, Callan woke before the sky had fully lightened. There were no paw prints on the rug, no obvious trace left behind. But across the room, in the place where the first morning light had begun to touch, Bramble sat with his back turned, facing the basement door, ears alert, front legs braced gently on the floor, as though ready, not waiting for a command no voice would give. Callan rose, his fingers unconsciously tightening at his side. And for the first time in all the years since returning from war, he walked toward the old wooden door that had remained closed, untouched, sealed like a wound that never healed. Bramble did not look back. He simply shifted to the side, just enough to clear the path, as if he knew that what waited behind that door belonged not to one man's past, but to the crossing point of things no one dared speak aloud. The door opened without much noise, but enough that the sound echoed down the narrow stairs, leading into the basement, where the scent of old wood and broken brick had long turned to dust, hanging in the air like memory turned vapor. Callan descended slowly, hand brushing the worn wooden railing, and with each step, his own footsteps began to blend with another rhythm. Unspoken, undefined, but so familiar that he felt, for a moment, as if he were walking backward through his own life, returning to a time when everything wore a uniform and moved only by command. He found nothing shocking in the basement, just old crates marked with the insignias of past units, a few black and white photographs, and a faded map tacked to the wall with rusted pins, the red circles nearly erased by time, but still showing the sweep of operational zones across the Middle East, with the words Sentinel Ops barely legible in the bottom corner. That map, though it named no one, held him still for a long time, until the soft steps above pulled him back to the present, and he looked up to find Bramble lying again by the door, not watching, not calling, just waiting. That afternoon, when Callan drove into town to pick up a few necessary supplies, the sound of drilling rang out across the street from the library. A group of workers were rebuilding the old diner that had half burned the year before. And standing among them was a man, salt and pepper hair, back held straight, an old military jacket slung over his shoulders, leather gloves worn at the seams, and a walk that seemed drawn from another time. So much so that Kalen stopped in place. The man didn't look around, but there was something in the way he bent over to check the concrete foundation. Something in the posture, the tension of it, that made Callan feel a chill spread slowly down his spine. When he asked the shopkeeper about the new arrival, she replied in a flat, matter-of-fact tone. "Oh, that one? Name's Damon Hale. Just moved in from out of state. Said he's retired. Rented that house down at the end of Birch Hollow. Brought his kid with him, Eli, I think, 8 years old. Doesn't talk much, but hasn't caused trouble." Kalen thanked her and said no more. But on the way home, his eyes kept flicking back to the construction site, as if some reel of old footage had been projected onto the present without warning. That evening, Bramble was not in the house, as he usually was. Circling the backyard, Kalen finally saw him by the fence, body taut, ears high, but no growl in his throat. He stood still, completely still. And through the gap between two wooden slats, Callan saw a small figure, a boy with messy brown hair, shoes caked in dirt, crouched low, tracing shapes into the earth with a twig held loosely in his hand. Bramble didn't step forward, but the fur along its shoulders lifted just slightly, and each time the boy's stick edged closer to the fence line, its body tensed another degree, not in fear, not in readiness to attack, but in that strange in-between space where instinct wrestled with memory. The boy, undoubtedly Eli, looked up at the sound of Kalen's footsteps. His pale blue eyes reflected something curious, not fear, not delight, just a stillness that felt older than his years. "What's your dog's name?" he asked, voice soft and drawn out, like someone speaking to someone who might not be good at listening. Callan didn't answer right away. Bramble hadn't moved its eyes off Eli, and for one strange moment, as the late sun spilled gold across the yard, there was a sheen in those dark eyes. Not the shimmer of emotion, but a kind of recognition, as if something long buried had surfaced without warning. "Bramble," Callan said, quiet and plain. Eli gave a faint smile. "I like dogs, but my dad says we shouldn't go near the ones with scars." The words fell into the silence like a small stone dropped into still water, barely a sound, but enough to send ripples running deep through the listener's chest. Callan almost asked something, anything, but Eli had already turned, running down the narrow path that led to the last house on the street, just as the sunlight slipped behind the line of old pine trees. That night, Bramble didn't make its usual rounds. Instead, it lay curled near the front door, eyes open, body slightly drawn in as though trying to push some memory back into its shadows, but unable, or perhaps unwilling, to turn away from what had been stirred. Callan sat at the table. The military tag hadn't moved from its place. But this time he didn't look at the side with the name Hale. He turned it over, to the back, where a long scratch had partially obscured something else, and there, almost invisible to the naked eye, was a faintly etched symbol, a 5-pointed star folded inside the letter R. That symbol wasn't part of any official branch, but Callan remembered. Not because he had seen it before, but because he'd once heard of it, in a sealed-off meeting, near the front lines, when someone whispered about specialized training units buried so deep in the system they weren't even under High Command's oversight. Sentinel OPS. They called them the Shadow Trained. Callan looked up. Bramble was watching him, eyes unblinking, as if Bramble remembered the symbol too, not because it had seen it, but because it had lived inside it. Outside, wind brushed across the rooftop, tapping against old sheets of tin and sending a sound through the night that resembled chains shifting somewhere in the dark. The next morning brought a slow, whispering rain. Early autumn drops tapped across the cabin's overhang, rolled down the gutter's edge, and struck the earth below in widening circles, soft and steady like breathing. Inside, the cabin had no scent of coffee, no sound of a sweeping broom, no radio playing in the background. Only silence remained, not the same silence as before, but a silence freshly born, stretched long like a breath held between two stories yet to be told. Callan sat on the back porch, eyes resting on the patch of yard where he had once built a crude wooden frame for training Axel, the dog before Bramble, now nothing but a bare stretch of ground, marked only by faint claw tracks, half lost to time. The coffee in his hand had long gone cold, but his hand didn't move. His thoughts weren't on the war, not on Hale, not on Eli, only on one thing: how a dog could keep perfect rhythm, night after night, for 8 straight nights, as though someone was lying unseen at the border between dream and waking, waiting to be called back by a signal no ordinary ear could hear. Bramble lay 3 paces away. Its posture wasn't alert, yet not quite relaxed either. It had curled one side of its body, tail tucked gently beneath, head resting against the dry wood, eyes half-lidded in that way dogs have when they are both ready to retreat and unwilling to miss a single breath from someone they've chosen to stay close to. The rain thickened. Droplets hitting the canopy of old leaves above began to sound like a slow, distant drum, part of a ceremony only nature understood. Callan set the cup on the porch floor. He didn't look at Bramble, didn't speak. He simply extended his hand, not stiff, not rushed, hovering a few inches above the ground, palm open, fingers loose, as if waiting not for permission but for something to arrive on its own terms, in its own time. Bramble didn't move for the first 5 minutes. But in the 6th, it turned its head. Its eyes no longer looked toward the forest. They shifted, quietly, slowly, toward that outstretched hand. And then without a sound, without a twitch, without a single sign of hesitation, one front paw lifted. Light, precise, like the sound of rain meeting soil. Bramble placed its paw in Callan's hand. The weight settled, but it didn't feel heavy. It wasn't the feeling of skin on fur or man meeting beast. It was something thinner, something invisible, a thread stretched across time, frayed, broken, and now somehow finding its ends once again, not through words, not through glances, but through a gesture so quiet it touched something buried too deep to name. Callan didn't pull away, didn't grip or lift. He simply held still, allowing Bramble's paw to remain, as if his hand had been shaped long ago for this moment alone. Outside, the rain still fell, steady, unhurried, but beneath the wooden awning, time seemed to pause for a fleeting moment, just long enough for 2 rhythms of breath to fall in sync, just long enough for neither of them to have to brace themselves for yet another night of holding on. That evening, Bramble didn't make the rounds. Instead, Bramble lay beside Callan, closer than ever before, its body angled softly toward him, no tension in the spine, no guarded space between them. Callan reopened the folder from the shelter, skimming through the clipped and clinical remarks written by hands that had likely never looked past the surface of a dog like Bramble. Notes like, does not integrate, shows minimal response, displays signs of heightened alertness. Words that tried to reduce an entire soul, one that had walked through war, into a few bullet points on recycled paper. He closed the file and set it down. Bramble lifted its head to look at him. Once again, its gaze didn't reflect anything precise, but it carried the strange weight of being seen. Not like a watchman tracking a stranger, but like a witness who has endured long enough to know that true understanding isn't found in the eyes, but in the silence 2 beings choose to hold for one another. Callan reached out, not to the ground this time, but gently to the top of Bramble's head. For the first time, he made the choice. His fingers moved across the thick coat, rough, unbrushed, not soft by any measure, yet every strand felt like it had held fast against time, surviving wear without surrendering its core. Bramble didn't flinch, didn't bow its head. It simply stood still. Then slowly, it closed its eyes. By midnight, Callan had not yet fallen asleep. He sat by the window, staring out towards the forest. The moon was faint tonight, veiled by passing clouds, but just strong enough to cast strands of light through the canopy, dropping silver smudges across the front yard like the fading trace of memories returning. Bramble sat beside him, silent. And out there, near the end of the lane, where the newly fixed fence stood beneath the trees, footsteps echoed. Not rushed, not misplaced, just steady, deliberate steps pressing down the grass, punctuated by the soft scrape of boot soles brushing against gravel. Callan stood, but Bramble had already risen before him. Neither looked at the other, but both turned toward the growing sound, toward the wooden gate that rarely opened, now left ajar by a sliver. And from that narrow opening came a voice, low, level, caught half in the wind. "Excuse me, is this the dog that used to be at Echo 9? Callan stepped out into the dark, carrying no flashlight, asking no questions. There was something in the man's voice that didn't need repeating. Not because it was certain, but because it had risen from the kind of buried place where memories survive not through accuracy, but through ache. The man by the gate looked to be in his 50s, thin build, collar of an old khaki jacket frayed with use, arms wrapped around a brown folder. His eyes squinted through the mist, but when he saw Bramble, he didn't move closer. He didn't retreat either. He simply froze mid-breath, as if time itself had halted to confirm that what he was seeing was real. "Who are you?" Callan asked, his tone firm, not cold, but weighted. "My name is Nash. I used to work as a psychological medic for Echo 9. When the unit disbanded, they reassigned me to the rear echelon. But I never forgot the dogs." Bramble didn't growl, didn't advance, but its eyes never left the stranger's frame, and one paw edged subtly forward, not in threat, but in recognition. The kind of movement made by someone who's heard that voice before. Not in conversation, but in the clipped cadence of field commands spoken under sun, sand, and blood. Inside the cabin's small kitchen, Nash laid out the file on the table. The pages were yellowed, some barely legible, most photocopies of deployment logs, training notes, and one grainy photo. 4 dogs beside 3 men, all of their faces overexposed by harsh sunlight from the right side of the lens. But Bramble, or rather the one marked S09, stood at the edge of the formation, lean and sharp, its eyes not looking at the camera, but toward something farther away. Something no one else in the picture seemed to notice. Echo 9 was a pilot program, Nash explained, an off-record project not listed in formal archives. The objective was to train Special Operations K9s with cross-reflexive conditioning, essentially giving them autonomous processing ability so they could handle unexpected scenarios, even in the absence of human command. Callan turned a page. And what happened? There was a large-scale exercise, 7 human units, 4 dogs, a live night field simulation, no fatalities. But something went wrong. One of the dogs broke sequence. Instead of engaging the simulated target, it sought an exit route, and it pulled the other 3 with it. Not long after, the program was shut down. The dogs were reclassified. Callan looked up. Reclassified is the nice word for being erased. Nash gave a quiet nod, then stopped mid-motion as Bramble stepped forward toward the table, one forepaw lifting gently to rest against the edge of the chair, his nose tilting ever so slightly toward the photograph. Nash pulled a torn note from his pocket, the edges worn and frayed with time. Only one name was engraved on the dog tags from that batch: Damon Hale. He wasn't regular military. He was a behavioral analyst, but more than that, he specialized in animal psychological conditioning. He was the lead in training Bramble's unit. Kalen remained still, hand resting on the corner of the file, as if holding it in place might somehow keep everything else from shifting out of reach. What did he do to them? His voice didn't rise. It simply dropped lower, as though the question itself weighed more than it should. Nash turned to the window, where the rain had finally ceased, and the light was beginning to return in thin streaks. "I don't know the full extent," he said after a pause, "but I do know this. Once, Hale told me, if you want to create absolute instinct, you have to first destroy the capacity for choice." That sentence echoed through Callan's mind not like a scream or a shout, but like a siren that had been sounding all along, low and steady, drifting like smoke through a room that had never quite cooled since its last fire. When Nash left, Bramble stood by the door. Callan didn't call him, didn't try to keep him close. He only watched as Bramble decided for himself whether the space left behind them was a door that could be closed, or a threshold that led back into what could never be forgotten. When Callan turned back toward the table, the folder had been closed again, but on the surface, right where Bramble's paw had touched, there was a faint mark. Not a scratch, not a claw print, just a damp impression in the shape of a circle, as if left by a single drop of moisture. It might have come from his fur, it might have come from his nose, or it might have come from a memory, one that had just stirred itself awake. Callan looked again at the photo, and this time his gaze traveled further, to the background behind Bramble, where, on a barbed wire fence, someone had painted in white, Delta R23/DH Hale. He pulled open a drawer, reached for an old, weather-worn notebook, flipped to the page long marked but rarely touched. The paper was still blank, except for a single line written in fading blue ink. Axel, Level 3 response, Desert Trial 2007. Callan's fingers tightened around the pen, and for the first time in years he added a new line. Bramble, Echo 9, D. Hale, verify R23 designation. Outside, the wind had picked up again. And by the fence, where the dry leaves had just been swept aside, a small wooden box had begun to surface, its lid poking slightly above the earth, just enough to reveal the corner of a stamp long blurred by time. Eli appeared the next afternoon, one arm curled around a small backpack, the other holding the crumpled edge of a half-eaten cookie wrapper. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He simply stood by the fence, exactly where the box still lay buried, and gazed at Bramble, who lay in the shade of the old tree, head resting but eyes quietly alert, meeting the boy's stare with something close to recognition. When Callan stepped outside, what struck him wasn't curiosity or fear in the boy's face. It was something far older than his years should carry, a gaze forged not in childhood questions, but in the quiet weight of having seen something too large for words. "Mr. Callan," Eli said, voice soft but steady, "do you think that sometimes adults keep things hidden, not because they're bad, but because if they said them out loud, everything would stop being the same?" It was not a question that needed an answer. Not right now. Callan sat down at the edge of the fence, just a few arm lengths from the boy, the branches above them swaying gently in the wind, as if trying to cast a moving shadow over the silence between two people who didn't share an age, but shared something else neither of them could quite speak aloud. "My dad used to say there are things people shouldn't be allowed to remember," Eli continued. "He never liked talking about the military, even though the house has so many stickers and maps. And one locked room." Callan touched the edge of the wood beside him. "Have you ever gone inside?" Eli shook his head. Number, but I saw him once, standing there, for hours, just standing still in front of the door, not moving, like he was guarding it, or like he was afraid that something inside might find a way to come out on its own. They sat like that for a long time, and Bramble, who had not taken his eyes off Eli, watched every movement, not with suspicion, but with a cautious attentiveness, as though something in the boy's posture, in the way he held the cookie wrapper, even the tilt of his chin, mirrored a gesture long buried in memory, too familiar to be ignored, too distant to name. "My dad, he looks into people's eyes a lot," Eli said, voice drifting like dust in late light. "But his eyes never feel warm. Even when he smiles, it's not how happy people look. It's like he's measuring something, like he's figuring out where to store what he just saw." Callan turned slightly, and for the first time noticed the boy's left wrist, faintly bruised, the skin healed but still pink at the edges, like a wound that had closed before it had been allowed to fade. He didn't ask. He simply remembered. "I'm not allowed outside much," Eli added. "My dad says there are people in town who used to know things he wants to forget. He says they'll hurt me if they find out I'm his son." Callan took a deep breath. The wind blew again, rustling the leaves in soft waves that sounded like the whisper of something fragile, something that might break if spoken too soon. "Are you afraid of him?" Callan asked. Eli didn't answer right away. He didn't nod. He didn't shake his head. He only turned his eyes toward Bramble, then whispered, as if even the wind shouldn't hear, "I'm not afraid of people who hit. I'm afraid of people who know how to stay quiet." When Eli had gone home, Callan stepped out into the backyard, brushing away the thin layer of soil above the wooden box he had buried long ago near the base of the pine. The box wasn't heavy. It wasn't locked either. Inside were a few yellowed pages, a local map marked with red circles, and a small metal insignia, a 5-pointed star interlocked with the letter R, the same symbol engraved on the reverse side of Bramble's military tag. Tucked beside it was a narrow slip of paper, the handwriting slightly slanted, leaning left like it had been written in haste. They will remember, not with the mind, but with the trembling. Callan picked up the insignia and placed it in his palm. He had expected it to be cold. But it wasn't. It was warm, faintly, unmistakably, as though someone had just touched it. Inside the house, Bramble wasn't lying by the fireplace, like usual. Bramble was standing in the center of the room, ears up, eyes fixed on the front door. Callan stepped in, still holding the insignia, and his gaze met Bramble's, unwavering, unblinking. There was no bark, no sudden movement, but Bramble's body had begun to tremble. Light, rhythmic, not a shiver from cold or fear, but a pure, unfiltered reflex, something deeper than thought, deeper than command. And in that single instant, Callan understood. Bramble's memory didn't live in photographs. It didn't reside in papers or reports. It could not be summoned through words. It surfaced through those small, unmistakable tremors, the kind that whispered not from the mind, but from a place where time had stopped, and pain had refused to leave. That night, Callan didn't sleep. He spread the documents across the wooden floor, arranging them in sequence, from Echo 9 to D. Hale, to the strange designation R23. The wind outside didn't howl, but something in the air had shifted. A signal, faint but undeniable, was drawing near. And in the middle of the night, long after the lights were off, the wind chime outside the porch gave a single, solitary ring. Only one. But Bramble rose, not to look at the door, to look at the far corner of the room, the one touched by a narrow blade of moonlight through the window pane. By morning, Eli showed up earlier than usual. He wasn't carrying his backpack. No snacks in hand, just a faded gray t-shirt with a tank print, hands buried in his pockets, eyes locked on Bramble from the moment Callan opened the door. "Mr. Callan," he said quietly, "I want to take Bramble to see something today." Callan didn't ask why, didn't say no. He looked at Bramble, sitting on the front step, head tilted slightly, not looking at Eli, but down the narrow trail behind the fence, the one that led into the forest, where sunlight barely broke through and dead leaves always returned, no matter how many times they were swept away. Eli took the lead. He didn't rush, didn't dawdle, moving like someone whose feet already knew each root, each bend, each raised knot in the path. Bramble followed, not shoulder to knee, but always within a few steps, as if drawn by something older than habit. Callan walked last, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes tracing the subtle sway of Bramble's tail, that small, nearly imperceptible flick that seemed to move only when the boy said something unclear. 15 minutes in, the forest dipped, a hollow carved by wind and time, and at its base stood a small wooden shack, low-roofed, silvered with age, door hanging unevenly on rusted hinges. "I hide here sometimes," Eli said, pointing gently but not touching the door. "When my dad's angry, I walk here, sometimes after school, sometimes in the middle of the night. This is the only place he never follows." Callan scanned the area. Everything looked aged, untouched, except for a single red string loosely tied to a branch on the left corner of the shack. It wasn't meant to bind. It was meant to mark. Maybe a signal. Maybe a promise. Bramble stopped at the doorway. Didn't enter. Didn't move. Just stood. Still. Eli stepped forward and opened the door with both hands. The hinges let out a soft groan, not loud, not sharp, more like the strained breath of someone reopening a wound not yet healed. It was dark inside, but dry. The scent of old timber filled the air. A few folded blankets sat in the corner. A small flashlight rested atop a dented tin box. "I used to sleep here," Eli whispered. "One night, Bramble came, but didn't go in." It was raining that day. Callan leaned forward, scanning the interior more closely. The floor was clean. No signs of rodents, no animal prints. But in the back left corner, where the wall met the ground, one plank stood out, newer nails, firmer hold, slightly raised. He reached out to touch it. Bramble growled. Not loud, not fierce. It came like a breath too heavy to hold, a sound pulled from somewhere deep inside the ribcage, where old warnings live, waiting to rise. It wasn't anger, it was memory, a reflex so deeply embedded that it emerged before thought could interfere. And in that trembling, low sound, more felt than heard, something unspoken returned to the surface. Eli stepped back, his voice low, uncertain. "I've never seen Bramble like that before." Callan didn't answer. His hand remained pressed against the edge of the floorboard, where beneath the aged wood there was something. Not metal, not earth, but a hollow space just wide enough to hide something meant never to be found. He pulled out the small knife he kept in his pocket and slid the blade beneath the plank, prying gently at the edge. A nail gave way with a soft snap, and for a moment a shaft of light from the narrow window cut through the dimness and struck the opening, revealing a square cavity, its interior lined with yellowed newspaper, and at the center, lying perfectly still, a small brown leather pouch, the kind designed for compact military documents, built not to draw attention, but to endure. Callan reached in and retrieved the pouch. Bramble stepped backward, 2 short, precise paces, his head lowered, though his eyes remained open, wide and watchful, and from his nose a single drop of moisture fell to the floor, not hurried, not hesitant, but with the slowness of something remembered by the body before the mind could catch up. Callan unzipped the pouch. Inside was a stack of photographs, not family photos, not battlefield shots, but image after image of dogs, one by one, each shown in various stages of their lives, some still young and bright-eyed, others wearing training gear, a few standing at attention, and more than one lying motionless in a sterile white room, a red marker drawn sharply across the chest. Every image bore a designation: R19, R20, R23. At the very end, there was one final photo. Just one, taken from behind. A man, his face obscured by angle and light, was resting his right hand on the head of a dog. In his left, he held something small, perhaps a remote. The glare from the flash blurred the edges, but if you looked closely, you could see it. The dog wasn't looking at the man. It was staring directly into the lens, its eyes wide, not frightened, not flinching, but as if asking a question that no one had yet dared to answer. Callan turned the photo over, face down on the table. Bramble remained in place, still unmoving, but the fur along his spine had lifted slightly, as though something unseen had passed against him, against the grain of memory. Eli sat quietly on the doorstep. "I never thought there was anything under there," he said. "Last time I came in, I just remember the wind. It felt colder than normal. But this time—" He looked up. "This time, I think Bramble already knew." Callan nodded slowly. Inside the pouch, there was still one more item, a scrap of paper, folded neatly in quarters. He opened it. The ink was hard, angular, pressed deep into the fibers of the paper. R23. Unerasable. And beneath that, a heavier stroke. Bolder. "He looks at me like I'm the last person left who still refuses to speak the truth." DH. Outside, the forest seemed to still, the wind caught momentarily in the trees. But far beyond the clearing, just at the edge where woods turned to shadow, a figure stood, not close enough to touch, but near enough to see every movement through the gaps in the branches. At their feet, the soil was disturbed. A single footprint ground into the dirt, then turned away. Rain didn't come all at once, but from the north, thick clouds began pressing into the sky, not like a storm, but like a great hand settling over the mountains, heavy and quiet. From Callan's window, the thin blinds swayed softly with the new wind, not the usual breeze of pine and stillness, but something denser, laced with moisture, stirring the cries of birds in retreat and dragging dry leaves across the walls like fingers tracing forgotten names. Callan had just placed the folder back on the table when the phone rang. A clipped, insistent sound, too sharp, too sudden, breaking across the silence of the house like a siren warning that something had cracked wide open. He picked it up. On the other end, Mrs. Harper, the keeper of the old town library, her voice a little off balance. "Callan, have you seen Eli? Damon said the boy went out this morning, but he hasn't come back." Callan stood up so fast the chair scraped back hard. But it wasn't the words that moved him. It was Bramble, who, until that moment, had been lying quietly near the door, suddenly rising, his eyes locked on the jacket hanging from the back of a chair. His nose lifted, sniffed once, then growled low, barely audible, before stepping forward. He stopped short of the sleeve, left arm, and stared. There, embroidered faintly above the cuff, was a stitched circle enclosing 3 diagonal lines. Callan was out the door in seconds, taking nothing with him but his mud-worn boots and a flashlight. Bramble ran ahead, needing no command, his pace cutting through the softening ground, leaving a trail of deep, sure prints across the yard, over the fence, and into the narrow path lined with fallen leaves and the fading scent of a boy who had passed this way not long before. The first drops of rain fell by the time they were nearly a mile from the house, deep into the woods. It did not fall hard, but cold and persistent, the kind of rain that doesn't soak you at once, but seeps through in layers, like memory trickling back on nights you try not to remember. The kind of rain that makes your breath shorten, one shallow pull at a time. Bramble veered westward, off the trail entirely, into a part of the woods with no path, only moss-covered rocks and thick branches that twisted close together like they were trying to hide something from the daylight. Kalen slipped twice on the slick stone but never stopped. Every time his flashlight beam found Bramble again in the dark, he counted the beat of his heart. 3 pulses for every step. Not fast. Not slow. Just steady enough to follow what he wasn't ready to lose. The wind had picked up. The trees no longer whispered. They collided, branch against branch in short, urgent bursts that sounded more like warnings than movement. Ahead, Bramble came to a halt, right where a large, moss-covered rock jutted from the earth, and at its base, snagged on a thorn bush, was a small strip of fabric. Callan crouched down. It was part of a gray shirt. The hem was uneven, the buttons torn, and most telling of all, it carried a scent. Not blood, not mud, but something more fragile. The smell of a child's skin, of sweat mixed with milk, and something faintly sweet. Maybe a cookie once clutched too long in a warm palm. Bramble inhaled, nose pressed to the cloth, then lifted its head, eyes locked in the direction of a tangle of fallen branches. Broken limbs snapped mid-stride as though someone small had bolted through, too fast to look back. A low growl rose from Bramble's throat. Then it sprang. Callan followed without a word. No command. No hesitation. By now the sky had darkened nearly to night. There was no thunder, but lightning laced the ridgeline, each flash briefly illuminating the forest. 2 shapes cutting through the woods like streaks of white across rot-stained bark and clawing roots. 1 man, 1 dog. At the edge of an old quarry, long abandoned, now overgrown, Bramble skidded to a stop. Its head dipped low, nose pressed into the rain-soaked earth. Callan caught up, fell to 1 knee beside it, and saw them. 2 small footprints, leading toward a dense patch of brush. And next to them, a plastic toy soldier, rubber, olive green, missing 1 leg, rifle in hand, helmet askew. Callan picked it up. It fit perfectly in his palm. Light, smooth, but colder than anything he'd ever held. Bramble turned, not to look at Callan, but at the slope leading down toward a rocky hollow, where the thicket grew too thick to see through, where light didn't land, where silence hung like breath unspoken. The wind came again, fiercer this time. But it couldn't erase what still lingered in the air. The boy's scent was still here. Bramble lunged down the incline as if it had never once doubted its path, as if every rock, every root, every crooked branch had already been memorized by something deeper than sight, by the echo of another's memory, one that wasn't Bramble's own, but had been etched into its being by something too enduring to forget. Callan ran after it, boots sliding through mud, wind slashing against his face like sharp leaves. But nothing slowed him, not the rain, not the cold, not the storm closing in behind him, because the last flicker of his flashlight had just caught the blur of Bramble's tail disappearing beneath the arch of a hollowed tree trunk, where splintered limbs framed an opening shaped like a crooked mouth, waiting to be looked into by someone brave enough to see what it held. Bramble stopped. No bark, no movement. Half of its body slipped into the tree. Then, from inside the dark, through rain and rustling leaves, and the branches above rattling like bones in the wind, a sound came out. A breath. Shaky. Small. And not Bramble's, but from a body much lighter, much smaller, and yet heavier than everything now crushing Callan's chest. He dropped to his knees, raised the flashlight. And there, curled tightly in on himself, arms around his belly, head tucked to his knees, soaked shirt clinging to narrow shoulders, hair plastered to a pale forehead, was Eli. The boy didn't move. Each breath trembled, visible in white clouds that stuttered at his lips, like steam struggling to rise in the cold. Bramble hadn't moved either. It lay pressed close, spine curved against the boy's back, legs tucked in, head resting gently over Eli's chest, not crushing it, not weighing it down, but keeping it lifted, protecting the fragile rhythm beneath from fading too far, from drifting too quiet. Its fur was soaked, but the side pressed into Eli was dry, as if Bramble had turned itself into a barrier, angling against the rain, shielding every inch of that boy with its body, until someone finally came. "Eli?" Kalen exhaled, crawling fully into the hollow trunk. There wasn't room for three, but he didn't back out. He pulled off his jacket, spread it beneath the boy's soaked body, then curled an arm under and around him, nudging Bramble only just enough to fit his hand to the boy's back, where warmth still lingered, where life still flickered. Callan's pulse pounded, not from panic, but from the raw truth pulsing beneath his palm. The boy hadn't let go. He had simply passed into Bramble's hold. "Can you hear me, kid?" Callan whispered, voice softer than the storm outside. "You did good, Eli. You held on." Eli didn't answer, but his eyelids twitched once, then stillness, then another blink, slower, followed by a long, trembling breath that lifted his chest just enough to graze the collar of his shirt. Bramble moved closer again. One front paw rested gently on Callan's hand, as if to say, "You don't have to hold alone. From the beginning, we've been holding together." Thunder rumbled beyond the edge of the forest, not sharp, not sudden, but drawn out, deep and resonant, like the sound of a metal cable struck by the head of a hammer, reverberating through the marrow of the trees. The storm swept through, tearing the canopy into moving veils of mist, rain falling not in bursts but in clean, unbroken lines from a sky that had no shape, no form, just pressure and weight. But within the hollow of the stone, there was no longer only the sound of wind. There was breath now, steady, growing deeper with each inhale, the breath of a boy who had just crossed the threshold between being and no longer being, not through his own strength, but because a wordless body had shielded him from the coldest part of aloneness. Callan knelt there, beside the dog and the boy, his hand never lifting from Eli's back, his eyes fixed on Bramble's, where the light from the flashlight struck not to reflect, but to sink in, like a lantern submerged in dark water, steady and unwavering. He didn't ask how Bramble knew, didn't ask how he had tracked him, didn't ask why a dog once marked as beyond rehabilitation had done what an entire town could not have managed, had the news reached them a few minutes too late. Because within the warmth that Bramble had preserved for Eli, within the rhythm of breathing he had matched and maintained through every yard of forest and stone, there was already an answer, not in human words, but in the way he had lain still, had used his body as a wall in place of shelter, his soaked fur as a barrier so the boy's trembling wouldn't reach his own heart. When Callan lifted Eli onto his back and began the slow climb out of the crevice, Bramble followed. Not quickly, not urgently, but with purpose, each paw pressing deeper into the soaked earth than the last, as if marking the trail with a quiet declaration. Here walked a soul who did not run when someone else needed to stay. By the time they emerged from the woods, the sky was still leaden with cloud, but on the eastern horizon, a pale ribbon of light had begun to break. Faint, unassuming, but enough to see, far off between the trees, a solitary figure standing. The figure did not move forward, did not speak, only watched as a man A dog and a breathless child emerged from the forest's shadow, with eyes that Callan had never seen mirrored in anyone else before. Damon Hale did not ask if Eli was all right. He didn't step forward either when Bramble halted in the middle of the yard. Head lowered, ears slightly folded, eyes locked on Damon's right hand, which remained tucked in the coat pocket, fingers unmoving. Callan passed him without a word, without a glance, and for a brief moment, between the wind rattling through the weathered fence slats and the last shiver of cold left over from the night's storm, there was something not spoken aloud, but present nonetheless. A question once posed not in words, but in the still, sharp gaze Bramble had cast toward a photograph. "Do you still remember what you buried?" The Oak Ridge police station was quiet that morning. Only one officer remained at the desk, the rest out inspecting storm damage. Callan spoke plainly. The missing child, the retrieval, the stone hollow, the leather pouch, the photographs. The officer took notes, nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the local news looping silently across the screen behind him. A fallen power line, a collapsed roof, and finally, the last image of the broadcast. Damon Hale helping to rebuild the fence behind the church. Sleeves rolled, expression unreadable, as though life outside went on untouched. And that name still belonged to someone ordinary. Callan didn't raise his voice. He simply left the pouch on the counter and walked out. He wasn't looking for validation, not immediately, because when he returned home, Bramble was already waiting at the door, not scratching, not whining, just standing there, eyes steady, telling him in the only way he knew how that he was ready. Not for a chase, but for a slow and deliberate walk toward the place where truth no longer needed to be said aloud. That afternoon, Bramble led the way. No circling, no stopping to sniff every bush as he often did, only a straight path, following a scent that had never quite left him, a line of memory that lingered in bark and stone, in old mortar and disturbed soil, the kind of residue most people assumed the wind had long since carried away. Callan followed close behind, holding a small trail camera. New batteries, focused not on faces, but on steps, on the stops and starts, the subtle indicators Bramble gave each time he paused, then moved forward again. When they reached the edge of town, the last house, set against a tall stone wall on one side, a scattering of thinning cypress on the other, Bramble slowed. His gaze shifted. Not toward the front door, but left. Toward a patch of planting soil left unfinished. A square of dirt just untidy enough to draw the attention of someone who knew what to look for. The leaves scattered across it formed a lazy camouflage, thin and indifferent, but enough to veil what had been recently disturbed. Bramble sat. He didn't dig. He didn't bark. He simply raised his right paw, tapped once, then looked directly at Callan, not pleading, not commanding, but offering a certainty that required no translation. "Here. This is it." Callan reached into his jacket for the small spade. He brushed the leaves aside, scraped the first layer of dirt. Then a second. By the third, the edge of the blade struck something solid, not metal. Wood. A rectangular box. Unpainted but marked, etched faintly into the grain of its side, the same emblem seen once before on a military tag, a broken circle enclosing 3 slanted lines. Callan opened the lid. Inside, wrapped tightly in faded cloth, were objects arranged with the kind of precision born of ritual or guilt. He peeled each layer back, slowly. And there, in quiet succession, emerged a second military collar, identical in design to the one Bramble wore, a faded training pouch bearing the faint imprint, property of Echo 9, and at the very bottom, a tightly wound reel of magnetic tape, an audio recording, waiting. It was an old type of tape, the kind only used in specialized equipment, no label, just a single line, handwritten in pale blue ink. Reflex regression, R23, exercise 5. Kalen looked up. Bramble was still sitting there, still unwavering, eyes locked forward like a soldier waiting for the final command to be carried out, not in resistance, but in completion. As dusk fell, Callan returned to the police station. This time he didn't speak. He simply handed over the bag, along with a pre-printed note, attached to a short video clip showing Bramble identifying a location. The desk officer opened the bag, read for a while, then stood, said nothing. A call was placed. A vehicle was dispatched to the station. Outside, Bramble sat just beyond the entrance. The wind tugged gently at its ears, ruffled the thick fur along its nape. But its body held firm, spine straight, gaze fixed on the main road, where the last light of the sun poured through the tall windows of a building still half asleep in a time of peace. When Callan returned home, Bramble walked beside him, not pressed close, but close enough that every step now held steady, no longer trembling. They didn't need to be believed. They only needed ground quiet enough to wait for the first sound of an unlocked door. And that night, in a surveillance room buried beneath the county headquarters, the tape began to play. The first sound was not a voice, it was a growl. The growl of a dog being dragged back into a memory it had never chosen. It wasn't the sound of barking, not explosive or loud, but low, sustained, coarse, like metal scraping across stone, not meant to threaten, but to declare that it remembers. In that small, dark room, a security officer looked up from the screen, his eyes slowing just slightly, while the technician beside him adjusted the volume, not to hear better, but as if instinctively trying to contain something they both sensed should never have been captured. From the tape, after several seconds of silence, came a voice, human, clinical, clipped. Subject R23, reflex conditioning, week 5. Initiate scenario level 2, command conflict. The growl ceased. Then the rattle of chain, claws scraping metal flooring. Then silence again, longer than expected, filled only by the rapid breath of a creature trying to unlearn its own instinct. The next morning in Oak Ridge came slowly. The storm clouds hadn't fully lifted, and the sun rose as if it were pushing through fogged glass, the kind used to keep hidden things from being seen too clearly. Callan sat on the back porch. In front of him stood Bramble, not sitting, not lying down, just standing, upright like a signal post, unmoving. Its eyes weren't lost in thought. They were locked, unwavering, on the dirt path trailing past the house, the one where strange boot prints had marked yesterday's softened ground, where a man had stood between 2 rows of trees and said nothing at all. Damon Hale returned before the sun